This is Trial Transcripts Exposed by Crime in Court with Heather. Raw courtroom reads with my commentary. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Crime in Court with Heather. This is Trial Transcripts Exposed. We are reading through the entire Menendez trial, or rather the retrial, which took place in 1996, 95 to 96, and we streamed through. We were able to watch the video of the first trial, which ended in a mistrial, and now we don't have video for the second trial, so we're reading through the entire transcript. And we are going to continue off with the testimony of Dr. Wilson, Dr. John Wilson, who's going to talk about fear and PTSD mainly. And, there's the whole argument with fear. The state doesn't want any talk about fear coming in, even though the whole defense is that they were afraid. So that makes no sense. And he doesn't want him to even talk about any other experts' work, which that's why you hire an expert also, is to review other experts' work and give your opinion as to where there might be flaws or inconsistencies or where you agree on things. That's exactly why you hire an expert. And in the last episode, there was an argument after they sent the jury home, and they the court, the Honorable Judge Stanley Weisberg was the one who decided, well, no, we'll decide as it comes in. I'm not gonna make any decisions now, but he's gonna side mostly with the state here. So before we get into it, hold on, I don't have my members Wall of Fame up yet. I need to thank my members. If I could get it up. Sorry. Didn't mean it like that. Here we are. So the file is up on my screen now, is what I meant. And want to thank Toyota Girl 67, SLB 29488. May the force be with you. 4313. Jessica Wienand 6079. Mrs. Apples with a Z 2007. Butler 89833, Brooke JF, Jen P 773, Boom Chicka Wow 1, my favorite. I mean, I love them all, but that one just makes me laugh. And so does May the Force be with you. And finally, Kendall B 5757. Thank you guys for being founding Justice Insiders. You too can be a founding Justice Insider if you join my channel as a Justice Insider between now and June 30th. You will get that designation. So thank you guys for being here. All right, so before we get into our reading, I kind of want to talk personally. I'm in a mood. I'm just in a mood. I've been fighting with people all over X because I feel like another content creator is being unfairly persecuted for something that we've now found out she didn't even do. And so I was just tired of being quiet about it. So I spoke out about it, and I get attacked by Baker and Will and get called a bunch of names, which that's fine. They can call me names. I didn't say they couldn't, but the point is that I come to them with facts and then I get called names. So it's really that's what happened. And this whole thing has been blown out of proportion, mainly because of the Broken Baker's stream that his Four Loco or whatever, he was drunk and went on a tirade, a drunken, angry tirade about Jessica Machado. I'm going to talk about it. I don't care. I'm going to say it. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being quiet about things that I'm passionate about, because I try to be, private here. I don't give you guys too much. I tell you a little bit about myself, but I don't give you too much. And I don't like to take sides, and I think sides are stupid. But at this point, kind of clear that there's a group of people that might be wanting to take out Justice Machado. So I'm just going to say that, leave it at that. So right now, I'm just in a mood. I've been fighting. At this point, by the time you see this, it's like days old or probably, much later. So the point I'm trying to make is just I'm feeling feisty, got a little bit of fight in me right now. And because of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I cover the Menendez case specifically and why abuse is so near and dear to my heart, and why people who go around calling other people abusers just out of nowhere, that kind of bothers me a little bit because I've been abused. I mean, who hasn't been? A lot of us have, right? There's many of us that have. But there's many that haven't. And until you've experienced it for real, you don't know. And you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm going to be delicate with this, but I'm going to give you guys info as much as I can about my youth. This all pertains to why I do the Menendez trial and why I'm really passionate about it. So when I was about 14, 15, this was a few years after my father had passed, my mom started dating a new guy. He was fine and all, whatever. He was friendly. I got along with him. And one Sunday morning, he called my mom's phone. My mom had her own line. I knew it was him. He was like the only person that called. Sorry, mom. Um, so I knew it was him. So I just went to pick up to tell him, like, hey, she's not back yet from church. It was Sunday morning. She usually goes and does her grocery shopping right after church. Whatever. So that was what I was just going to say to him. And then he kept me on the phone. He talked about some inappropriate things, and then he did some inappropriate things to himself. May the fucker rot in hell. So he did that. I told my mom immediately afterwards. He hid for a day or two, then comes back with whatever excuse he does. And my mom somehow believes him. Sorry, mom, I have to kind of give a little info here. And in doing so, she let him back into our lives. I had to suffer growing up with this this MFer in my home. And I mean, enraging, enraging. He knew not to do it again because I wouldn't stay quiet. So there was that. But he may have hurt some other people along the way after this all happened. And then, he was remaining in our lives and he hurt some other people, very young people in our lives that we love near and dear. Okay. So I'm just going to say it like that. So we've been through this. We've been, and not to this extent. Oh my God, Jose was, a sadistic man. So I'm not going to say that I have anything or knew any experience like the Menendez brothers, but it is something that is near and dear to my heart, near and dear to my family. The topic is near and dear to my family. So that's why I'm doing this. I also want to say, because the topic today is hypervigilance, or at least that's one of the topics that they're going to talk about on the stand. That's hypervigilance is real. I have developed it. I think I've learned to tune it out most of the time now, but hypervigilance is real. And as I'm saying that, I'm noticing my dog's making a bunch of noise downstairs and it's very distracting. And that's what hypervigilance is. You know things. You can't like let it out of your head. You hear the sounds, the smells, the bright lights, everything. It can overpower you, and you're super sensitive to all of the sounds and things in your environment. I have this. I've dealt with it. It's frustrating. So so let's move on to my life. I'm going to share a little bit more about my life experience and the abuse that I've suffered. So I married a man who is very abusive, verbally abusive. very narcissistic, definitely has a narcissistic personality disorder mixed with other things. This was before he joined the military. He was messed up in the head, but he got even more messed up apparently in the head afterwards. And every day was a battle. Everything I did was a fight. He tried to control every little thing in my life, and he made me miserable. And I was miserable. Um, he gaslit me. And he told me just, I could never be enough. I could never do enough for him, and I never gave him, enough praise or recognition or whatever. And it was just constant, daily, and I walked on eggshells around him. So when Baker throws around that he's been abused, I take offense to that. If someone was seriously abusing him, that's that's different. Uh-oh, I hear my dog doing something downstairs. Hold on. Anyways, what I was saying was that when Baker says that Jess was abusing him by saying some funny things about his sexual prowess, somehow that's abuse. Okay, that's not abuse, buddy. That's not abuse at all. But whatever. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Um, so like I said, so I relate and sort of I relate in some ways to the Menendez brothers and the case in my life and as to how, some of the things progressed in my life. But um I think being a predator to a child is one of the worst things you can do on this planet. And anyone who does that deserves the heat of 1,000 suns in hell when they burn, because I don't like people like that. And I'll just leave it at that. So this is very passionate to me. Love this, or I love talking about this subject because I know about it and it's important to me. We're going to get into some of the psychologists and doctors here, so coming up. So we're going to, maybe learn some things about abuse and what it does to you. So let me shrink my camera. Let's get started here with um whoopsies with the afternoon session of the Menendez brothers. This is after they come back from lunch. The court says, "All right, the witness is here, the lawyers are here, the defendants are here. Anything we have before the jury come out?" Mr. Kant says, "Yes, Your Honor, if I may be heard, there's a couple of things I would like to bring to the attention of the court. First, we would object to counsel's behavior this morning. We didn't want to make an issue in front of the jury, but we'll object at this time so that perhaps we can have something done as to the fact of counsel directly addressing the jury this morning." The first time I read it with sass, and if you don't like it, too bad. The first time first time she directly addressed the jury was when the court was remarking to the jury about "we've been engaged in other matters or tending to other business" or something like that. And I don't remember what phrase she used, but she directly turned to the jury and she directly repeated the last phrase out of the court's mouth to the jury with a big smile on her face. I don't think it's appropriate for counsel to directly address the jury. There's enough time for argument, and she shouldn't begin her argument at this point in trial. And then there was another time later when she directly addressed the jury. There was a juror who was coughing, and she turned to the juror and said something to the effect of, "I'm sorry." So again, I don't think it's appropriate for counsel at any time to direct any of her remarks towards the jury. Court says, "Well, as go ahead." Mr. Khan continues, "I would also object." The court says, "Have you finished on that subject?" "Yes." That's how I imagine him saying it, like really like a little child. The court says, "Okay, Ms. Abramson, I don't know what. Did you say something to the jury after I made my remarks? Ms. Abramson says, the only thing I said to the jury versus the court was one of the jurors were coughing, and I said, are you all right? And she said, I'm sorry. The court says, I'm asking the first question, the one about I made some remarks to the jury about the delay, and then you made some remark. I didn't make a remark to the jury, says Ms. Abramson. I made a remark to the open court. And what was that remark? I don't remember, she says. It wasn't anything significant. The court says, okay, well, then let's refrain from any remarks unless they're addressed to the court. There's no reason for them, and if you can't document what it was, it makes it even more difficult to deal with. But refrain from doing that in the future. Ms. Abramson says, I just want to point out I made no remarks the court heard whatever I said because I was looking at the court. I didn't hear it, if I heard it. Miss Abramson says, I think you did hear it, but you didn't interpret it as something I said to the jury because I didn't say it to the court, or I didn't say it to the jury. The court says, I didn't hear what you said because I didn't. I can only say again that I didn't hear it. Just refrain from doing that. It's always nice to be able to say something in response to what the court says or what others say, but whether it's nice or not, that doesn't fit in normally with the rules of the court. As far as the interaction with the one juror, that's not the subject of any comment by the court. That's just something that happens, and I understand the circumstance, and therefore it doesn't require any response. What was the other thing you want to talk about, Mr. Khan? These guys do not like Miss Aronson. They really gang up on her. It is so sick to see. I'm sick of the misogyny. I'm sick of seeing it everywhere. Some of our content creators. Anyways, where did I leave off? So Mr. Khan says, yes, the other thing I wanted to raise was various exchanges between counsel and the witness this morning, which were not part of questions, but were just little commentary along the lines of, well, I know you don't want to toot your own horn, and well, I don't want to toot my horn. Well, why don't you toot it a little bit? All of this cut. She asked him, yeah, he said he didn't want to toot his own horn when she asked him stuff about like his background. So you're objecting to that? What the hell is the problem there? I don't want to toot my own horn. Well, why don't you toot it a little bit? All of this off the cuff sort of little remarks are going back and forth between the witness and counsel, and I think that there should not be this type of dialogue between the witness and counsel. Counsel should ask a question, should not engage in that type of dialogue with the witness. The court says, okay, well, lawyers ask questions in different ways, and I'm not going to dictate how the questions are asked. Don't think there's anything improper in that dialogue. Finally, say something back to this weaselly little Mr. Khan. So we won that, at least. He says, you're next. Mr. Khan says, yes. The other area is one time during the witness testimony, the witness turned to the court and was directly addressing the court. As you know, Your Honor, this may be of particular interest to you. And I'm sorry to ask that the witness be admonished to direct his responses to counsel rather than once again making efforts to lighten the proceedings by directing his comments to various persons in the courtroom. Okay, well, I don't find that one isolated incident requires any response. Anything else? I mean, seriously. Now you're going to dictate what the witness can say and talk to and what he can do. Like sometimes witnesses talk to the court too. The court talks to the witness. It's okay, Mr. Khan. Sit down. Mr. Khan, the court says anything else? Mr. Khan says, yes. The next thing is, we would object at this time to some of the charts that counsel proposes to use during the course of her examination. Some of these charts were used in a hearing that we conducted before this court. And while there may have been some use for the charts at the time of the hearing, I don't see why those charts are necessary now in front of this jury. The purpose of the hearing was different than the purpose for the testimony before the jury. In that hearing, counsel was attempting to convince the court that these diagnoses with which we are dealing did not suddenly arise, but were the result of an ongoing process with some history behind them. For that purpose, the court allowed counsel to use various charts, and we see one of them in front of us right now dealing with the conceptual evolution of post-traumatic stress disorder syndromes, and it starts with the Industrial Revolution. It takes us to industrial accidents and railway spine and so on and so forth. So I would object to the use of that chart and other charts which counsel intends to use. Some of the other charts that I see counsel just put up on the board include charts about the common symptoms of trauma. And again, I think the issue before the court is not what the common symptoms of trauma are, and what are the general features of hypervigilance or the general features of trauma, but what are the specific matters which relate to the case before the court. Are you kidding? You have to explain what hypervigilance is. You have to explain what trauma is and what it can do to someone in order to understand this case. And the state just wants nothing to do with it, wants to cut it all out. Every little thing that they do to try to get it in, they object. And it's so frustrating. If I were Ms. Abramson, I'd be probably either full on gray hair by the end or I'd rip all my hair out because I'd be so frustrated. Anyways, I'm gonna grab a mint because my mouth is just super dry today. So, but I'm not gonna I'm just gonna keep it on the side of my cheek. Hopefully it doesn't bother you guys. Hold on. All right, hopefully it's all not, you won't hear it. As much as counsel would like to make this a trauma symposium and hear about, take testimony concerning other trauma victims and other disorders having nothing to do with these proceedings, I think it's important that we stay focused on this specific defendant and upon his state of mind at the time of the commission of the crime. And we argued in the motion that we filed with the court that this is one of the ways in which we feel counsel was able to confuse the jury in the first trial because she at that time jumped from population group to population group and then jumped from disorder to disorder and then spoke about generalized features of trauma and generalized features of hypervigilance. And it's something that we called at the time 3-card Monty. And that's exactly what we're seeing once again here. It's a 3-card Monty where if you ask one question about a Vietnam veteran, which she has already gone into, and then you talk a little bit about the battered woman, and then you talk a little bit about the Korean combat soldiers, which we heard about, and then we talk a little bit about Bosnia. And then somewhere between the line, we put in a throwaway question about Eric Menendez, and then we moved on to generalized features of trauma, and we talk about different disorders. Somehow we're creating a stew here. It's a trauma stew, and the jury doesn't know exactly where to draw the line in saying what, if anything, relates to Eric Menendez, and somehow Eric Menendez either gets lost in the shuffle or benefits from it all. And after a while, we reach the point where we don't know if he's a concentration camp survivor or veteran or World War II. This is a ridiculous argument. I think that's important for us to remain focused on the issues before the court. So I would object to the charts that are currently before the court. And I'd also object to further testimony concerning different population groups whose experiences do not relate to the case before the court and to disorders which I have no bearing upon the issues before the court. The court says, all right, and your response. Ms. Abramson says, I'm presenting to the court now, Your Honor, as promised, some research materials, and I just want to make a record of what I'm presenting. Neurobiological and clinical consequences of stress and normal adaptation to post-traumatic stress disorder by Friedman Charney. And I'm not even going to try to say that name. I'll just highlight it. Mr. D, we'll call him. And that's the book. I don't expect the court to read it, but I think if you look it over, you'll get a sense of what we've been talking about. The body, the court cuts her off and says, this is relating to the issue of neurobiology. And she says, let me make it clear. I do not intend to respond to what I just heard from Mr. Khan because, in my opinion, it was utter nonsense. And the court says, that's what I've asked for. Ms. Abramson says, it's utter nonsense. I don't know what he's talking about. The court says, I don't want to get into the issues of neurobiology at this point. Ms. Abramson says, I just want to tell you what I'm giving you. The court says, I don't want to consume time on that. Ms. Abramson says, I think his argument is ridiculous and has no basis in any concept of proof of facts. If the research had, what happened? The court says one of the speakers fell. Okay. Ms. Aronson says, I didn't even know there was a speaker there. The court says, hasn't been used for quite a while. Okay, well, then you don't need to put it back up. Ms. Abramson says they've never cited any authority that says that the court should take a pair of scissors and cut its way through the body of research and cut out some kind of paper doll of the pieces of the research that go into an expert's opinion that should be presented, leaving out all the other bits and components of the research that form his expertise on his opinion in a particular case. I think it's very clear from the 801 hearing. I'm going to try to find either a transcript or something from the 801 hearing if we can find it. If anybody knows where it is, send me information, please. crimeandcourtchannel@gmail.com, or you can reach me on X. I think it is very clear from the 801 hearing that we had from the testimony so far that the body of understanding of the effects of traumatic stress comes from various population groups, but reduces down to the same clusters of symptoms for all such people. And what's up on the board, the small charts, are the common symptom clusters, which we're going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about which one of those symptoms we found that my client was suffering from at appropriate points in time. And by the same token, I'm going to take him, although I don't have it charted now, but I'll have it charted for later on. I'll have it charted for later on in his presentation, the DSM-IV diagnosis of PTSD. Remember, we were actually on DSM-V now is the current. Back then, their current version was the fourth version. And have him indicate which of these symptoms my client has had and what specific behaviors of my client or reactions of my client or states of mind of my client demonstrate those symptoms are the basis, in other words, for his conclusion that my client had those symptoms. So there's nothing narrative about the charts. If they were case specific narratives, counsel would be objecting on that basis. This is just a checklist so the jury can follow along to some extent what we're doing. With respect to the larger charts, which is the evolution of post-traumatic stress disorder, I am not going to take the witness through the items of those charts. I simply want to mark them and identify them as a chronological history of the various syndromes that have been labeled that now are subsumed in either battered person syndrome or post-traumatic stress disorder. Oh, you just drooled all over me. You just had water. He just took a drink of water and then came and drooled on me. Sorry about that. Um, I believe I finished that last sentence. And I want those marks based on his expertise because I expect the prosecution's experts to claim none of this exists, and therefore, I want those available in order to deal with him. So I'm not going to take any time at all with the charts except to identify them as showing the evolutionary process of the descriptive language used to deal with the same thing that we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, battered person syndrome, anxiety syndromes. The court says, we're not talking about anxiety syndrome, we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and battered person syndrome. Ms. Abramson says, yes, but the witness has testified, Your Honor, that they are both under the category of the DSM of anxiety syndromes. They're all part of it. It's not a separate syndrome. It's not part of it. There are many different ones. So that's what I intend to do. The court says, okay. As far as this historical chart, the objection is sustained. It really doesn't have any relevance at this point. Are you effing kidding me? She can't even use her visuals to help explain to the jury symptoms of something she's claiming her client has and trying to show it along the way. This is ridiculous. This is absolutely bullshit. Sorry for my language, but it is. He continues on and says, he's already testified in a general sense to the development of this research, and therefore it would be, Mr. Levin says, I'll show you the other ones. The court says, the offer of proof it's really not relevant to his testimony. This reminds me of Judge Gull. There's no nexus. There's no nexus to the Odinists of the town, even though we know Odinists run rampant in town, but there's no nexus in the Delphi case. Same thing here. Judge is just, there's not relevant. I see nothing. I'm blind. I'm blind to what's going on because I want your client to get a conviction. Ms. Abramson says it is relevant. It charts the development that he described occurred, and this puts it in writing that that's what he does. Without my having to take him through it step by step, I'm not moving to admit them. I'm just trying to get them marked. The court says his testimony is before the jury, and the objection to the court or to the chart is sustained. What's the other one? That's just the same, says Ms. Abramson. The court says more detail of the same thing of the historical development, and the court's ruling would be the same to that. This guy's a dick. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, can I go on with the other thing and make the record of what I'm giving the court? The court says, no, not until I finish ruling. The same with that third chart, which deals with, Ms. Abramson says, they're all part of one chart, Your Honor. The court says, Mr. Levin is taking them off one at a time. Ms. Abramson says, it's just 3 pages of the same chart. The court says, except I haven't seen it for several months, so it's not easy for me to rule without looking at them. Ms. Abramson says, it's okay. I didn't remember that they were all the same either. The 2 charts that are up there now, the one on the right is called Hypervigilance, and it describes what it is, and the one on the left is common symptoms of trauma. Court says, and your witness is prepared to testify that the defendant displayed these symptoms? Yes. And this is the same symptomology that is the basis of his diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes. Court says, is that what you're going to say? Yes. And battered person syndrome. Let me show you the difference. The 4th category of the most common symptoms of trauma, the 4th category are these. Now, part of, I believe this 4th category is technically part of PTSD, but is an accepted consequence. Am I right in that? An accepted consequence of trauma. It's not part of the diagnostic material, but it is part of the diagnostic material for BPS, for battered person syndrome. The witness says it's also an associated feature. He just chimes in. I love it. The witness, Dr. Wilson's like, oh, but it's also this. He's not supposed to be talking right now. It's great. Ms. Stevenson says also an associated feature. The court says the objection is overruled as to those 2 exhibits. So she is now going to be, the other ones about the history and stuff, he ruled them irrelevant for whatever reason. But now the symptoms, that's the most important part, is the symptomology. So he is allowing that to come in. So that is a win for the defense. He says, all right, as far as your description of what items you want to provide to the court relating to the biological reaction to trauma, you can put it in writing rather than put it on the record. Just have someone write down what you're giving us without consuming any more time. Ms. Nahara says, Your Honor, before we break today, Ms. Abramson says, you also wanted the Barton case. I have that. The court says, it was provided to me through the clerk. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, before we break today, we can take some time in the afternoon and figure out what we can do about getting an examination ordered of the defendant. Yes, says the court. Ms. Nahara says, thank you. If we could take care of that today, that would really be good. Court says, I was thinking about this weekend since we have a 3-day weekend. Ms. Abramson says, we want to be heard on that. The court says, I'm sure you would want to be heard on that. What a jerk. Just the way he talks to her. Ms. Nahara is like, Your Honor, we would like this. And he's like, sure, no problem. You got anything. Do anything for you, toots. And then Ms. Abramson comes along and says, you know what? I'd like to be heard. Yeah, I'm sure you would. What is that? Is that proper judicial etiquette? I don't know. Anyways, she says, we don't object to the examination just as to when we'll have any time. First of all, to discuss the parameters and then to prepare our client, which under Estelle, we have a right to do. Court says, as I said, I'm thinking about this weekend. Let the jury out, please. He is so much of a dick right now. I don't like Stanley Weisberg. He wasn't this bad he was bad in the first trial, but I don't remember him being this bad. I really do think that he's changed his rulings, changed his tone a lot with the defense. If you watched the first trial versus this, that's what I'm seeing. And I'm seeing he's also changed since the beginning of the trial. Now he's run out of patience with the defense and he's just done. And anything that the state wants, he's like, sure, you can have it. Court says, okay, the jury is back in the jury box and we'll continue with the direct examination of Dr. Wilson. Ms. Abramson says, thank you. Dr. Wilson, with respect to the basic concept that traumatic stress causes effects that manifest themselves in symptoms, and as those ideas are applied to child abuse and particularly to the sexual molestation of children, is that a new idea or is that one of the earlier concepts of these post-traumatic stress disorders or syndromes? It's actually one of the earliest ideas in modern psychiatry and science. Among the most important, earliest formulations in scientific investigations as to the traumatic effects of childhood abuse came from the work of Sigmund Freud and his colleagues from the 1890s to the turn of the century, and indeed, the early conception of post-traumatic stress disorder was conceptualized as traumatic neurosis resulting from repeated and intense childhood sexual abuse within families. So this post-traumatic stress disorder has been known since the 1890s at least, but we just called it something else. We called it traumatic neuroses. I think traumatic stress disorder sounds much better than neuroses. Sounds like you're neurotic. All right. So it is then accepted in the scientific community that post-traumatic stress disorder can develop as a result of multiple traumatic events. Yes. Does each traumatic event have to be enough to have by itself caused post-traumatic stress disorder to be relevant to the investigation? No, there can be repeated events that have the cumulative effects in terms of the stress response and its impact to the victim. And strike that. Freud was talking about adults who had been sexually molested as children who, as adults, were manifesting these symptoms. That's correct. Do the effects of traumatic stress, if the person has developed post traumatic stress disorder, do they, with the passage of time, go away? For some people, they do. For others, they don't. And when you make a diagnosis of post traumatic stress disorder, are you able to make it, strike that, is it appropriate to make it without trying to know or find out what is the traumatic event? No. It's important to establish what were the stressors, what were the specific traumatic experiences that an individual had in their life experience. Why is it important to know? For example, whether this person is showing these symptoms based on having been in combat or having been molested as a child or having been in a plane crash or having been kidnapped or any of those. Why do we have to know? It's important for the clinician, for the person doing the treating of the patient to know the specific types of traumatic experiences, the specific types of stresses that have experienced in the traumatic event, because those particular experiences will have different effects or different impacts on the individual depending on the nature of the trauma, how long it lasts, the type of experience, whether it caused bodily harm, whether it had psychologically traumatizing, brutalizing, terrorizing effects, or whether it was a terrifying or intense experience that overwhelmed the person to cope with what happened to them in that particular traumatic experience. So, to establish the link between the traumatic stressor, the specific experience of the individual to the symptoms, one needs to know as much as possible about the nature of the traumatic event. Now, that's true so that you can treat them properly. Yes. Is it also true that you can understand what their symptoms are? Yes. And in a forensic setting, which means when we start talking about the legal community, and is it necessary before you would be comfortable rendering an opinion that someone suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, that you also formulate an opinion of what was the traumatic event or were the traumatic events that led to the development of the disorder. That's correct. Now, if you can, with the mind of trying to educate basically laymen, which is everybody here right now, but you, could you, Mr. Khan says, I would object this time, Your Honor, to the prefacing of the questions. Overruled. You can ask your question. Thank you, Your Honor. Could you explain, first of all, what is traumatic stress psychologically? Sure. Okay. Traumatic stress psychologically refers to the fact that a person had experienced a traumatic event of one type or another. Traumatic stress means that following the trauma, there's the appearance or development of a stress-related symptom for the person who's undergone such an experience. By definition, we talk about traumatic events as being outside the range of usual human stress. Beyond daily stress, beyond normal acceptable life stresses that we all have. The traumatic stresses are at the extreme end of the stress continuum and generally involve physical threat to physical integrity, to bodily well being, to psychological well being. I can attest to that. I was in very poor physical shape medically. I had a lot of issues going on, and I think that that is what kind of exacerbated all of my being in my abusive marriage at the time. I think that's what exacerbated my autoimmune diseases. I've got fibromyalgia. That's not autoimmune, that's nervous system. I think I have POTS, which is your autonomic system. I do have an autoimmune disease, which is called ankylosing spondylitis, or rather, non-radiographical spondyloarthritis is the real name for it, but whatever. It's a long one. So I can attest to your body changes after being physically, emotionally, mentally, it doesn't matter. And in fact, I would say that emotional, verbal manipulation, that type of abuse is worse than physical. Physical physical injuries can heal. It's the stuff that sticks with you. I will never be whole again after my marriage. I am as complete as I can be at this point in my life. I don't have joy, not like I used to. Like, I'm not the same person that I was before the marriage. I mean, I find joy all the time. I'm happy, but it's just not the same. Like, I am not the same happy-go-lucky person that I used to be. And I don't like it. But anyways, it is what it is. That's what happens when you've gone through something traumatic. So, moving on with her response, she says, or his response, I'm sorry. Dr. Wilson says they include stressors that, in one way or another, are catastrophic and tend to overwhelm the normal capacity of human beings to cope with these kinds of experiences. And because they're so overwhelming and so taxing on the human capacity to deal with what happens, that there's an aftermath, and the aftermath is that the person continues to re experience some components of that traumatic event after it's over. Now that's the development of the symptoms, and there's a wide range of these symptoms that develop following a traumatic event. But when we talk about traumatic stress, that's what we're referring to. Traumatic stress is those kinds of experiences, what we call in the scientific literature stressor experiences that impact adversely on the individual's sense of well-being. Is there some notion that underlies this theory that there is a normal human capacity to cope with stress, to deal with it, to get over it, so that it doesn't cause any lasting harm, that there's something inherent in people that allows them to do that? Yes. In general, I mean, people are resilient and there is a normal stress response sequence, and we understand that normal stress response sequence quite well. And that's predictable substeps that people go through following a trauma by which they attempt to integrate the experience of the trauma and get on with their life without having residual adverse effects. Apart from trauma, you're also talking about normal stress. I mean, the kind of stress we all encounter in our lives. The stress of being a witness? Sure. The stress of being an advocate. The stress of doing a job well. The stress of a child who's sick. All of those things. Objection leading, Your Honor. Sustained. Are those things normal stressors? Yes. The answer is stricken based upon the previous question. Could you describe some normal stressors? There's a range of normal stressors: getting up in the morning, commuting to work, paying bills, taking care of children, meeting time schedules. All of these are daily kinds of things that all of us face, and they all contain some degree of stress because they involve some degree of challenge or tax to our capacity to meet what we have to do. Those are normal daily stressors. Now, with respect to the traumatic stressors, are those things that I think you've said that they're outside the range of normal events? Objection, leading, overruled. Yes. And are these some things that the scientific community agrees are always outside the range of normal, apart from the specific severity of the individual event? Yes. What kind of things are always considered traumatic stressors? The type of events or experiences that are always considered traumatic stressors are those that pose the imminence of threat of life itself, threat to life itself. So we can think of such things as catastrophic stress in a disaster, where there's the imminent reality of the potential of one's own death in some kind of disaster. Another example from a scientific literature that's well known is torture. By that, I mean physical or sexual or psychological torture that has as the intent to inflict the fear of death in the person who is being tortured. I would almost go as far to say that Jose was torturing Eric when he was sticking pins and things in his thighs and butt. Remember that? He testified to that. I would say that's sexual torture and physical and psychological. Do as I say, or you get worse. I don't know. So that's another kind of experience that clearly and undoubtedly leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's where a person is in pain and repeatedly threatened with death, even though nothing life-threatening is happening. That's one component of torture, correct? This is a great question because Jose has threatened to kill multiple times, or either Eric or threatened to kill anyone Eric told, or whatever. He's threatened it. He's said he killed before, and I think that's psychological torture for Eric, thinking that his dad would kill him. That's one component to torture, correct. They can be threatened with their death through various means of torture when in fact the perpetrator, the torturer, may not wish to kill them but wishes to inflict such severe fear and terror that the person will do anything to not go through that experience and to do anything to please the torturer, to confess, to do anything to try to stop the punishment that they're receiving. What role does the emotion terror have in Is terror the emotion of traumatic stress? Objection, irrelevant. Court says overruled. The witness says terror is one of the emotions in traumatic stress. There are many of them, but terror is one of them. And is fear of imminent death one of them? Yes. And is a component of the kind of stress that overwhelms the person's capacity to cope and inability to escape the threatening situation in some traumatic situations that. Oh, sorry, I stumbled through that too fast. Here's the question again. Is a component of the kind of stress that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope and inability to escape the threatening situation. So is one of their symptoms the inability to escape, to run away? He says in some traumatic situations, that's an integral part of the trauma. that the person may see no escape, no exit, no way to survive, no way to get out of what's happening to them. And that component of having the fear of no way to survive or exit or escape is related to the experience of both terror, helplessness, and fear. Say that again. It's related to the experience of both terror, helplessness, and fear, which we've been talking about. Eric being afraid and being helpless, but now we've added the component of terror to add to this traumatic event. Now, you've indicated that various forms of child abuse can be traumatic stress and cause post-traumatic stress disorders or battered child or battered person syndrome, correct? Correct. And is battered person syndrome also a reaction to traumatic stress? Yes. Are there any types of child abuse that, by their very nature, it is accepted in the literature, does cause reactions, these kinds of psychological effects that one has to traumatic stress, or that, well, let me make it clear. I didn't understand any of that, so good. Are there certain forms of child abuse that constitute traumatic stress? Yes. What are they? Physical abuse, sexual abuse, or molestation, and emotional abuse or psychological maltreatment. So that's what constitutes abuse, Baker, in case you don't know. All right, so now, is all sexual abuse of children considered a traumatic stress experience? Yes. Why is that? Because sex, let me strike that. Even if it isn't accomplished by means of violence, yes. Even if it isn't accomplished by death threats, yes. Why? Because sexual abuse of children, first and foremost, violates the most basic bond between the child and the parent or the person doing the perpetration and the sexual molestation, and that is a bond of trust. So once that bond of trust is violated, then it blurs the boundaries between what is considered to be normal or what the child can understand to be normal versus that which is normal or abnormal. So the traumatizing impact is that the child becomes a victim to the perpetrator with a blurring of boundaries, with a violation of trust, so that the child then becomes an object for the perpetrator. It's a great way of explaining it. Eric was just an object to Jose. Something to get his frustration out when he was angry, something to control when he needed that sense of control. He just used him. And it's in that primordial violation of the trust between the adult perpetrator, or could be a non adult perpetrator for that matter, could be like an older sibling or cousin or whatever, something, and the child, that then begins to inflict psychological damage to the ego structure or the self structure of that child. And that is the primary scar. So that ego structure in the beginning of your development becomes scarred. The primary injury that begins to occur in children abuse, in child abuse. There are many others, but that's the primary violation. You have no sense of self anymore. You don't know what should be normal for you and what you should accept in your life and what you should not accept in your life. You don't have those clear boundaries anymore. So hard to cope with that. A lot of people struggle with that, myself included, in some ways. And is damage to ego structure a component of stress-related syndromes? Yes. Have there been studies, or is there, strike that, is there consensus in the relevant scientific literature that molested children, even if they've never been threatened with death or physically assaulted, associate molestation with the threat of extinction? Sorry, with the threat of extinction. Mr. Khan says, I would object as irrelevant. It is not specific to the defendant, Your Honor. Sustained. Ms. Amerson says, well, you have to ask the general before you can get to the specific, Your Honor. Sustained, sustained. Ms. Abramson says, in cases where sexual molestation is accompanied by violence and death threats, are there other consequences as well as the destruction of the ego? Objection, irrelevant. How is that irrelevant? The court says, and you propose this to be tied in by the witness's testimony in this case to this defendant. Ms. Abramson says, yes, indeed. Overruled. The witness says, would you please repeat the question? Ms. Abramson says, yes. You've talked about the nonviolent sexual abuse hypothetical that I posited to you before, where you talk about the psychological damage to the ego structure. When sexual molestation is accompanied by physical violence and threats of death, is there another range of symptoms besides damage to the ego structure that also occurs? Yes. And are those symptoms typical of traumatic stress? Yes. Now, up on the board, which nobody can read, not even me, is a chart, however, that, Your Honor, before I mark that, I've previously marked and I'd like to officially mark Dr. Wilson's CV consisting of, I think, 53 pages as the next in order. Wow, his resume is 53 pages, guys. I feel very unaccomplished in my life. He's about 50 pages longer than mine. All right, so the court says yes. Miss Abramson says, now, Your Honor, this chart has a pretrial exhibit number on it, formerly number 7. The court says, we don't have to refer to those, just mark them. Ms. Abramson says, just mark it as 392, and I'll put that number above the pre-existing label. That's the chart that says most common symptoms of trauma. And the chart to the right, Your Honor, I'd ask to be marked 393, and that one is entitled Hypervigilance. Now, first of all, with respect to the originating traumatic events, if you will, did you form an opinion in this case as to what were the causative traumatic events that led Eric Menendez to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes. If you could tell us, I don't mean incident by incident, I mean by categories of traumatic events, if you will. First of all, did you find more than one category of traumatic events that, in your opinion, contributed to his forming post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes, I did. Could you tell us what those categories are? The major categories are repeated sexual molestation with physical threat, repeated sexual molestation with threat, as well as demands for self-mutilation and self-punishment, and sexual molestation with repeated death threats. And these mother effers want to keep all of this out. I'm going to read that again because this is what Eric Menendez was subjected to in the however many 9 years of his life or whatever it was. It didn't continue on. It started, I believe, at the age of 7 or 8 and ended at 18. So like almost 10 years of this. So the major categories are repeated sexual molestation with physical threat, repeated sexual molestation with threat, as well as demands for self-mutilation and self-punishment, and sexual molestation with repeated death threats. That's 5 like major categories right there. Were there any other traumatic events that constituted the creation of terror apart from the sexual molestation that you've discussed that you based your opinion on? Yes. There are other acts that include acts of intimidation with verbal abuse with implied threat for more damaging physical consequences. There are acts of physical abuse involving slapping and hitting and pulling hair with implied threats of serious physical consequence, including beatings and death. So he threatened them with beatings and death. I'm sure he did it to Lyle too, but not to that extent. And Lyle I don't want to say he got off easy because he really didn't, but he, the pressure from his dad wasn't as great on him. I'll say that. Jose focused his negative energy mostly on Eric and didn't really give as much to Lyle. Lyle got, the praise and the glory because he was the oldest. And Eric was like what's that saying? Like the heir and the spare. That's pretty much what Lyle and Eric were to Jose. Lyle was the heir, and Eric was the spare. And that's why he took all of his negativity out on him, all of his anger out on him. It includes acts of physical and psychological degradation. Wow. Okay. So I'm trying to highlight all the things he's got here, but there's a lot. Psychological degradation in the sense of demeaning and abusive, denigrating verbal language that lowered the worth and value of the person and placed them into a subordinate, subjugated, dominated position. You know what? This is a great way to verbalize it, but it probably went over the jury's head because it's kind of using big words, but basically means demeaning, degrading language that was so awful to them that the Eric and Lyle were subjected to their ego, their own identities being crushed, fragile, very fragile, and being controlled by this person. They had to. They knew, like when Eric and Lyle, if you listen to Lyle's testimony in the first trial, you just did what Lyle or whatever Jose asked for, whatever Jose said for them to do, they just did it. There was no argument. It was controlled. He had total control of their lives. There wasn't a lot that they didn't control. And he goes on to say, and similar acts of a physical nature, accompanied by verbal abuse of the same type that resulted in subjugation, domination, subordination, and helplessness. Wow. I mean, I hope they get out. They need to be free with their loved ones around them, giving them all the hugs in the world. You know what I'm saying? After what they went through and then what the state put them through. I think it's time they go home. Hopefully they get put up for parole again soon. We'll have to keep an eye on that. All right. Now, turning to the chart that's up on the left, this talks about symptoms of trauma. Does this chart include what are known as symptom clusters? Yes. And are these 4 symptom clusters reflected here? Yes. What is the difference between why are these 4 symptom clusters? Why isn't there one long list of symptoms? There are 4 symptom clusters that define common symptoms of a trauma because they tend to fall into groupings. They fall into categories that define different components of the symptoms and develop in response to traumatic experiences, and they reflect different aspects of psychological and what I would also term psychobiological functioning. Oh, I'm surprised that wasn't objected to. So some of these, I guess you can't object. Well, you can't object when the witness is speaking, can you? I don't know. Probably not. So some of these symptoms fall into a category that deal with traumatic memory. Some of them deal with symptoms that are more sort of physiological in orientation. Some of them reflect symptoms that deal with the core process of the person's ego, their self structure, their personality, their internal state as it's organized in terms of their selfhood. Some of these other symptoms refer to emotional responsiveness, the patterns and types and capacities for emotional responding after a traumatic event, and more specifically, the affective or emotional components refer to changes that occur in the person's capacity to either experience or to control or what we call modulate their emotional reactivity after a trauma. So there are actually looking at different components of psychological and psychobiological functioning, and it's useful to break them apart because while they interact with each other, in a systemic way, because a human being is a human being, it's also important to look at differences that exist in each of these clusters for any given person who's been traumatized. Now, these are not these 4 categories, the way that they're written here, says Ms. Abramson, are not exactly the words as the post-traumatic stress disorder is defined in DSM-IV. That's correct. And we'll talk about the difference. Did you informing your diagnosis of my tongue can work today? Did you, informing your diagnosis of my client, go through the DSM-IV checklist and through the list of symptoms there and determine which ones Eric Menendez suffered from in order to support a diagnosis of PTSD? Yes, I did. And you have to do that, don't you? You have to make sure that the person fits the symptoms, the checklist, in order to come up with a PTSD diagnosis. That's correct. Now, the series of four symptom clusters, does this define an even broader range of psychological harm of physiological negative experiences that can result from the kind of traumatic stress of child abuse? It does. Does this therefore correlate with the broader definition of battered person syndrome? It does. And is it the fourth category here that is one of the things that is considered symptomatic of battered person syndrome? Yes. Now, just to indicate the four categories, can you read them? I can't see them. Do you know them by heart? I can't read it. It's too far away for me. Can I get down? Or I can get down. She says no. Ms. Abramson says no, I'll pull it down. Okay. What is the first category? He says, entitled 1, psychological reactions. Ms. Abramson says, what are the symptoms? First of all, I'd ask you to turn to 424 of the DSM-IV. I think that's where post-traumatic stress disorder shows up. Would you turn to the checklist? Okay. Now, when you're using this handbook, the DSM-IV, and you're seeking to render a diagnosis and you want to make sure that a person fits the description or the or bleh, or the classification, sorry, do you check what's called the diagnostic criteria for that particular disorder that you're trying to see if the patient fits? Yes. And on page 428, oh, yeah, it starts, you're right, 427. Is that where the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder begins? That's correct. I'm getting a cramp in my toe out of nowhere. Just came out of nowhere. It hurts, it hurts. Hold on, I'll come back. Okay, well, sorry I'm back. See, I get all sorts of health things going on here. So now the first thing that you're supposed to do is going down this checklist for post-traumatic stress disorder, you determine if the person has been exposed to a traumatic event or events in which both of the following were present. Well, let me ask you this. Are you supposed to determine if they've been exposed to a traumatic event in which two things are present? That's correct. Two things are, first of all, that they have had a traumatic experience, that they've experienced it, or they've witnessed it, or they've been confronted with an event that poses a threat to their physical well being or to the physical or psychological well being of other persons. That's the first component of the definition. Let's read that again because he uses big words. So, two things, they've experienced it or they've witnessed it or they've been confronted with an event that poses a threat to their physical well-being or their physical or psychological well-being. So anything, I guess that's just anything, your exposure to anything traumatic like that. The second component is that the person's response to that experience is one of the helplessness or fear or here. I don't, that's probably a typo there. It probably says fear twice. The second component is that the person's response to that experience. So you have to have an experience, and then the experience has to be a feeling of helplessness or fear. Again, Baker, you didn't have helplessness or fear, so you weren't abused. So it's a two-tiered component. Number one, they have a traumatic experience that's to some degree life-threatening or threatening to their physical integrity or psychological well-being that's extreme. And number two, they have a response that involves fear, helplessness or fear. Now, when we're talking about response, do we mean that at the time it's happening, they feel something? Yes. They have an emotional reaction. Yes, but they can also have that feeling come later as well. Okay, but just to keep it as simple as possible, would this be to compare, Someone could be involved in an earthquake and sleep right through it. Yes. And not have any response to it. Yes. Being involved in the earthquake isn't what causes the psychological harm, correct? It's possible. All right, but if you're in the earthquake and you know you're in it and you're terrified and you think you're going to die and your house is falling down around you, and then you're a potential candidate for to develop PTSD. That's correct. If you get real scared while it's going on. Yes. Now, how do you measure in analyzing a patient whether or not they had a response to a traumatic event? How do you measure it? Asked the witness. Ms. Abramson says, how do you know they did? How do you know that it's not my sleeping earthquake victim? There are a number of ways in which you attempt to measure whether or not they had a traumatic event. Not whether they had an event, whether they had a response. There are a number of ways to measure the response. First of all, it's helpful to talk to the person to see what their reaction was to the experience that they say that they've had, to look at their verbal description, to look at their emotional response, to look at the way that they characterize what the experience was like for them, to talk to them. It's important that that's important. That's one way that they can measure it. Another way you can measure it is to administer standard psychological tests that look at how the responses to psychological tests designed to measure post traumatic stress disorder. Symptomology compared to other people for whom we know have gone through similar experiences, so we can use psychological or psychometric testing to determine what their responses are. There are other ways we can look at it that as well, that we can look at as well, sorry, which are more medical and biologically based tests to look at the nature of the biological changes of psychophysiological changes that may occur in them after the experience that weren't there before. So there are biological changes that happen to someone who experiences a traumatic event or repeated traumatic events. And this guy says it's medical, biological based tests can show that there are changes. And now I'm sure this is going to be objected to and yada yada. But he has to be able to talk about this because it is science. Just because he's not a medical doctor, I think that was like their excuse. It's going to confuse them. No, I'm sure this guy knows what he's talking about. So it's not going to confuse them. He's there to provide information to educate them so they're not confused. Ms. Abramson asks, excuse me, can I have a moment? Can I interrupt you for a moment? Sure. Just excuse me for a moment. Attorney Abramson confers with the witness. The witness says, may I finish? Ms. Abramson says, I think I'm trying to do something simpler than what you're doing right now. Dr. Wilson, maybe I'm not being clear. He says the manual says to have to determine two things. Number one, that the person was exposed to this trauma, traumatic stress, and that they reacted to it. That's right. We're just talking about the first two things, right? Asked Miss Abramson. He says, right. Okay. So do you talk to them to find out what they felt about the thing, or either as it was happening or when they first became aware of feelings about the thing? Correct. All right. Because these are just the thresholds to decide whether someone suffers from PTSD, correct? Correct. Just because you're exposed to a traumatic event and have a reaction to it doesn't mean you will have PTSD. Objection. Leading. Sustained. Rephrase the question, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, all right. Is the determination that someone was exposed to a traumatic event and had a reaction to it just the threshold, the beginning of the inquiry? Yes, he says. What is necessary to actually come up with a diagnosis? What's necessary to come up with a diagnosis is to determine whether or not that particular person meets the diagnostic criteria set forth in the manual. Do they have the symptoms that define the disorder? Okay. Part A, the part that we were just talking about under the definition of PTSD, that part A is what we just talked about, that there is an event and that there is a response, correct? Correct. Now, after that, there a is there a part B? He says yes. A part C and D? Yes, there is. And B, C, and D are symptom cluster sections. Yes, it is. Like the chart you have in front of you, does the diagnostic manual put in groupings depending, I guess, on what type? Are the groupings dependent on what type of symptoms we're talking about? Yes. Are there types of symptoms that are related to each other? Yes. Are there basically three different types of classifications of symptoms? At least three, yes. All right. Could you tell us then, with respect to what I'm going to do is go to the DSM first and then back to our list to see there is correlation, is there not, with the three groups of symptoms as described in the manual B, C, and D with the 1, 2, and 3 on the chart? I don't understand that at all, but yes, he says. Okay, what is the symptom cluster? This is very confusing without a chart, without being able to see what the hell they're talking about. What is the symptom cluster? What is the title, if you will, of the symptom cluster that shows up in the DSM-IV as B, the first cluster? The witness says the title of this cluster B is the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in one or more ways, one or more of the following ways. And then there are 5 groups of symptoms listed. Now, what do they mean by re-experienced? Do you mean the person goes out and gets shot again or goes out and gets molested again? What do you mean by re-experienced? What they mean is the person psychologically and emotionally re-experiences what happened to them in the traumatic experience. They relive it. They revisit it after the trauma. Do they do it on purpose? Some people do. Most people don't. And how does it happen? I'm not sure what you're asking. If they don't want to think about it, why do they think about it? It's an involuntary process that what happened in the trauma is very painful, it's very distressing, it's overwhelming their sense of well-being, and so they have what we'd call intrusive recollections of the experience. They are unwanted thoughts, they're unwanted feelings, they may be unwanted thoughts that occur during the night in the form of dreams or nightmares. They may be very powerful or distressing feelings that suddenly emerge into their awareness. Feelings of, for example, sadness associated with witnessing the death of a person in a trauma. It could be a wide range of ways that people re-experience it, but not involuntary. Now, under symptoms, cluster B, does it indicate the various ways in which people re-experience the traumatic events? Yes, it does. What does it list as the various ways? There are 5 different ways. All right. If you give us first one, and then if I think it needs explaining, I'll ask you to explain it. What's the first one? Certainly. The first one called recurrent and intrusive distressing recollections of the event, including images, thoughts, or perceptions. And then there's a note here. It says, in young children, repetitive play may occur in which themes or aspects of the trauma are expressed. What does that mean? You mean for children? Yeah. It means they may, in their play, in their daytime activities, they may act out in their play. They may use objects and toys to relive what it is that they went through in the trauma. And is it commonly accepted in the literature that with respect to sexually molested children, they sometimes play games with other children where they mimic the molesting activities by using objects or toys? Yes. That's so sad. Mr. Khan says objection leading. Overruled. Witness says yes. So, if a child was sexually molested by anal intrusion with a penis, and then that child takes a toothbrush and mimics that activity with another child, is that the kind of thing that this section of the DSM-IV is talking about? Precisely. And that Has to do with what happened with Eric and Lyle when they were out in the woods somewhere. They were out playing, and Lyle was, they were both really young at the time, and Lyle used a toothbrush on Eric. It's a very emotional moment in trial one when Eric testifies to it and breaks down and crying, and or was it Lyle who testified to it? I think it was Lyle who testified to it, and Eric was at the defense table crying about it. It was very emotional. Um, and tough, tough. And these kids, well, they're not kids at the moment, but they've had to be re-victimized to these childhood traumas over and over again. And sitting through a second trial is doing it again. How long altogether? Eric Menendez was on the witness stand in the two trials for 15 days. Let that sink in. Would you want to be grilled on the stand for 15 days? I wouldn't. Um, Next question. Did you determine, strike that, did you form an opinion as to whether or not Eric Menendez had recurrent and intrusive and distressing images, thoughts, and perceptions of the traumatic events? Yes, I did. And what is the next category of those re experiencing events? The next category, two recurrent distressing dreams of the events, and then there's a note. In children, there may be frightening dreams without recognizable content. Does that mean without a memory of the content or with a content that just can't be described? What it means is that the child may have a dream in which the elements don't conform one to one to their actual experience. In other words, it's not like an actual videotape replay, but there are elements in their dream that refer to the traumatic experience, but not necessarily in a complete reliving of that experience in the dream state. So, are nightmares that have symbolic representations of the traumatic event considered re experiencing of the events? Yes. Nightmares can be considered you being re experiencing that event. Even in your dreams, you can re experience what happened to you. Okay. And did you, in your assessment in evaluation in this case, determine whether or not Eric Menendez reported a series of very frightening, repetitive nightmares? Yes. Is it significant for this purpose to see whether or not he's having nightmares that are a reliving of traumatic events, whether the same dream is repeated over and over again? Could you rephrase the question for me? Yeah, repetitive dreams. Yes. Do nightmares tend to repeat themselves ordinarily, or do nightmares based on trauma tend to repeat themselves, or is there no connection? Do you guys have repeating dreams? Just gonna pause here and ask. I do. I haven't had dreams for a while. Like I'm not dreaming. I don't remember my dreams lately, but um when I could, I would often dream of being chased. I wouldn't know what I'm being chased of or from. What was chasing me. I didn't always know, but I would always be like going through like secret passageways and like tunnels and like in through the walls and things and like trying to hide and like trying to find the person that's trying to get me. It's always like I don't know why that's a recurring dream I've had, but I don't know what that says about me. If anybody can tell me, tell me your recurring thoughts or recurring dreams below if you've had any recurring dreams or nightmares. All right. Um, the witness answered, "That's a compound question." She says, yes. Two parts to it. He says, first part, yes. The first part, nightmares do not necessarily repeat themselves, particularly in normal people. Traumatic nightmares are often repetitive because the content of the nightmare refers to what happens in the trauma. And until the trauma dissipates on its own without treatment, the person is prone to be reliving the trauma in a nightmare state in a repetitive form or forms. I wonder if this guy can read dreams, kind of. Um, and were you furnished with information that Eric Menendez had a series of, oh no, what's happening? Something, I don't know what that was. Something popped up saying contacting something. It's gone now. Okay. And were you furnished with information that Eric Menendez had a series of, in fact, a number of different repetitive nightmares? Yes. And did you form the opinion as to whether one or more of those repetitive nightmares did constitute reliving the trauma? Yes. And did you form the opinion as to whether or not any of those repetitive nightmares were specifically reliving traumatic sexual abuse? Yes. And was the information that you based that opinion on information having to do with these nightmares occurring beginning at a critical time period in his childhood? Yes. And what is your understanding of the time period at which these nightmares began? They began around 10 years of age, to my recollection. So, at least what he remembers, two years or so after the abuse started. What was your understanding about the duration of these nightmares? For how many years did he have them? He still has them. Same ones? Same ones. And is still having the same re-experiencing through nightmares of the trauma a symptom? Well, is that something that supports your current diagnosis that he still is suffering from PTSD? Yes. Did you examine the notes of Dr. Vickery, the psychiatrist who first started seeing him in 1990, to determine whether there were any information in those notes about nightmares? Yes. And in examining Dr. Vickery's notes, did you determine whether the information in his notes was consistent or inconsistent with the information you obtained about nightmares? It was consistent. Are you aware of information elicited in this trial concerning Eric Menendez suffering from nightmares as a child? Yes. And by the way, is putting a child in a bathtub of cold water an effective way to cure them of having trauma related nightmares? No. Is it, in fact, an effective way to deal with nightmares at all? No. Is it a non abusive way? I would regard it as abusive. And are traumatic content nightmares that are re-experiencing of trauma, is there any correlation between that being the source of them and the difficulty of waking up from them, or is that just idiosyncratic to the person? No, it's not idiosyncratic. There are both nightmares and night terrors. Both can have the content of a nightmare, meaning a dream. The difference is that in a nightmare, the person is able to wake up or may not be able to report the content of their nightmare, but typically has associated somatic or psychological features such as rapid beating, rapid heartbeat, and fear. In a night terror, the person may also have a nightmare, but the extinction is they cannot be aroused from their sleep cycle. So in a nightmare, person in a nightmare can't be aroused from their sleep cycle. That even with effort to arouse the person from their sleeping state is impossible to bring them to consciousness, and they continue in the night terror state. So both are possible in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder as it pertains specifically to nightmares. Do children, however, experience that terrors, I'm sorry, do children, however, experience night terrors who have not been traumatized? Yes. Okay, what is the third listed symptom of re-experiencing that appears in the DSM-5? 4, sorry. The third symptom under the B criteria, acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were recurring. And then in parentheses, it says includes dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur on awaking or when intoxicated. So he becomes disassociated with reality and has flashbacks of instances where he was being abused. And then there's a note in young children, trauma specific reenactment may occur. And when they mean that trauma specific reenactment in young children, does that mean that children act out the trauma? Yes. They play it. Yes. And in your evaluation in this case, did you form an opinion as to whether or not Eric Menendez experienced this feeling or feelings, particularly feeling as if the traumatic event was happening even when it wasn't happening. Yes. Now, I know we're going to get into it later, but is there a way to observe that people are having or experiencing these intrusive thoughts or intrusive re experiencing of trauma? In other words, is the only way you can know that this is happening because someone says, gee, I re experienced it, or I had flashbacks, or it was intruding on my thinking while I was working at the sawmill yesterday, or are there other ways to try to determine if this is happening? Sure. What are the other ways? Ways in which, in order to determine if this is happening? There are several ways. Perhaps the most dramatic form is that the person, if they're reliving the trauma and virtually replaying it in their behavior at this time, by that I mean they're behaving now as they did in the trauma, can be observed by an external observer, and they can see that the behavior that's occurring right now is different from their normal behavior, and it contains the components that reflect what happened to them in the traumatic experience. So, an outside observer can clearly see that that's something that happened to them before, and the behavior that's being observed now basically parallels what happened in the past. Can you give me an example of not necessarily case specific, but just something to clarify how that would look to an outside observer? I think the clearest example I can give you is when a Vietnam veteran has a flashback to being in the jungle of Vietnam, and he acts right now as if he did in the jungle of Vietnam, and he's terrified and he wants a weapon, and he's screaming and he's talking in Vietnamese. He feels that he's under attack. To an observer, this is a courtroom. Look at the person's behavior. There's something unusual here. That would be a clear cut example of the distinction between reliving a trauma versus knowing that that's not a normal response for that person for the situation. Okay, now apart from that, are there other signs that can be observed from the outside that someone is experiencing, for example, intrusive thoughts, reminders of the trauma, or having flashbacks of it? Yes. And what is it that is observed from the outside that suggests this re experiencing is going on? There are a couple of things that suggest it. One refers to both intrusive processes, and what is mentioned in the diagnostic manual is dissociative reactions, and this refers to a change in thought processes or intentional processes that the person may drift off. They may not be paying attention to something. And to the outside observer who's interacting with the person or who's observing that person, they can see that there's been a shift in their attention. I know someone who does this, and it can be kind of creepy. You can be like in the same room with them, and they're just like, "Whoa, hello." It's like they didn't know you walked into the room and you've been sitting there for 5 minutes. Sometimes that happens. Just saying, with someone I know, not naming names. All right, so there's been a shift in their concentration that they appear very suddenly to drift off. They may appear very suddenly look dazed. They may very, very suddenly to look like they're not quite there. These are the most common descriptions that are rendered of this change. So one knows a change in this person's capacity for concentration, attention, cognitive tracking, and then an awareness of what happened. And this is another important component. So when the person drifts off, loses attention, concentration, and has a flashback, that's internal to them where they relive the trauma. The outside observer sees that there's that change in their behavior and afterwards can say something like, "Hey, what happened? Where'd you go?" Question is, "Where'd you go?" I know. And he says, and the person says, "What are you talking about?" Because they're not aware that this change in their consciousness and behavior just took place. Now, that's another external observable behavior that can take place. Now, related to that is one other form, just to give a complete answer to your question, where you can see a clear psychological change. And I'm talking about here is manifest physical changes. The person starts perspiring, they start breathing rapidly. There's a change in their speech pattern. There may be change in their facial expressions. There may be change in their bodily posture that wasn't there prior to the onset of the episode of acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were recurring. Again, that's observable to the external observer. So you can see that these changes come on. And again, if you say to the person, hey, what happened? All of a sudden you broke out into a sweat and you soaked your shirt and you started hyperventilating, sorry, hyperventilating. If the person's in a dissociative reaction, they'll say, I don't know what you're talking about. And then they look at you or at themselves and they don't understand why they have this physical change, like they were perspiring and stuff. In some cases, however, they do know that they've had a flashback and they may be able to report it or they may feel self-conscious about saying it. Hey, I just had a flashback. Well, that's something I wanted to get to, says Miss Abramson, that people can have these re-experiencing experiences, have flashbacks, and not know they're having them. Yes. On the other hand, people can have it and know that they've had these thoughts and these flashbacks and the experience. That's correct. And the difference, you used a word called dissociative. Yes. Can you explain what dissociative means? Yes. Simply, it's not easy to explain. I know it's not easy to explain. Simply put, disassociation is a word that refers to a change in a person's perception or awareness of. Whoops, my dog just did that. I don't know why. We're looking out the window. Something is interesting to them. Sorry. Perception. Where was I? So, simply put, disassociation is a word that refers to a change in a person's perception or awareness or their thinking from their normal state. That's why it's called disassociation as opposed to action. There's a splitting off. So, there's this change in their self awareness and their perception of the external world or their awareness about themselves or awareness about their behavior. There's a change in the state. And so, that's why we call it disassociation. In the most basic sense, it's a fundamental shift in awareness. That may be the simplest definition. But the psychological components is that the person who engages in one of many forms of dissociative reactions is often not aware that that change is taking place or only becomes aware of that later. For example, when someone has highway hypnosis, oh, I hate that. And they're driving down the highway and they wake up and they go, oh my God, there's 3 hours disappeared. No, I don't get that. That's not what I thought it was. I thought it was when you keep driving and like you get hypnotized by the lane because you just keep seeing the same lane in the dark. You know what I'm talking about? That's what I thought highway hypnosis is, but I was wrong. Highway hypnosis, when someone has highway hypnosis and they're driving down the highway and they wake up and they go, my God, 3 hours disappeared. Where'd they go? They don't remember what transpired during those 3 hours. That's a common normal example of disassociation. Were they awake during those 3 hours? Yes. Were they driving the car? Yes. I mean, they didn't just fall asleep? No. So they're not waking up. They're just returning to awareness at the end of 3 hours. Yes, there's a change in their awareness state. That's a common normal one, but there are pathological examples of that as well. Is that why people go through this who think they fell asleep and wake up, don't wind up in crashes because they're not asleep? They're not asleep, he says. Well, what makes them zone out, if I can use that vernacular? Objection at this point as irrelevant, says Mr. Khan. Rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, under a sigh, as a function, what is the mechanism that makes one disassociate? Ms. Abramson says, as a function, what is the mechanism that makes one disassociate? There are many things that make people disassociate. Generally, there's stimuli, or we use the words sometimes triggers that cause the person to have a disassociative reaction. Let me give an example to explain this. A common trigger for Vietnam War Vietnam War veterans who are driving down the highway, to take that example, is that they may look up into the sky and they see a Huey helicopter, much like it was used in the war, and it's over their car, and they look to the right of the car, and here's the grassy knoll with thick trees, and all of a sudden they wake up 3 hours later and say, where am I? How'd I get here? Okay, was the trigger. The trigger is the helicopter, the grassy knoll, the trees. It triggers a memory about a similar place in Vietnam. They experience a change in state of awareness, wake up a little later, and say, "Hey, I don't know where I was for 3 hours." Now, they weren't unconscious in the sense of falling asleep, but they had a change in their state of awareness. They're not necessarily fully aware of what they're doing at the time. They're kind of on an autopilot thing, but someone else has taken over. And that's the kind of classic illustration of a dissociative reaction. And can now that's where they're seeing something that's similar to the trauma. Yes. But if they were, for example, if they went back to Vietnam, okay, and they were in the exact same place where they had experienced a traumatic event, does that, first of all, has that happened? Have veterans gone back? Yes. In fact, I have a research grant that we're studying that phenomena right now. They're taking people back to the Vietnam. Yeah. Yes. Have there been episodes where being there triggers the re experiencing? Absolutely. So there can be a more direct link if you're back in the same situation, if you're exposed to the same stressor, whether human or otherwise, that can make you disassociate or re-disassociate. You may not even need the stressors. The guys who go back to Vietnam don't have to have the Viet Cong shooting at them, but if they're back and they got the jungle and the heat and the smell and Vietnamese people and they got all these cues that existed 25 years ago, that's enough to trigger the reaction. They don't have to have the sense of the stressor. But it's all re experiencing of the trauma occurring in a dissociative state, or no? No. And that's why whole B criteria is delineating different ways people relate to trauma. Where are we now in the trauma? 4. What's 4? 4. Intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external clues that resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Now, we were just talking about that too. You were talking about external cues. You see the helicopter, you wind up back in the same place. You're confronted with the same, let's say, abuser. Then that can all trigger the re experiencing, correct? Yes, it can. What does this mean? The intro means that you can just start to have a thought about the experience that you don't necessarily have something in the environment. You don't have to have an external cue, an external situation, something similar. You can just be reflecting, have a memory pop into your mind. And then all of a sudden, your own memories can trigger an intensification of your psychological distress. And that's what the B4 criteria is. In other words, there's an increase in psychological distress. So the person has more anxiety, they have more distress, feel more pain, they feel more grief, or they can feel any of the emotions that were experienced during the trauma. It could be more terror, it could be more fear, it could be more fear. It could be more sadness. It could be more apprehension as to what's happening at a given point in time. Any of those emotions are possible, but that's the increased components of the B4 criteria. Okay. When it says increased, could you then be someone who is suffering from post traumatic stress disorder, let's say sitting in a library, reading a book, and a thought about having been abused crosses your mind and you experience intense psychological distress such just by thinking about it? Yes. How is that different than thinking about something bad that happened to you and just having some feeling of, God, that was awful. I'm glad I'm not there anymore. More normal. I mean, what's the difference? The difference is the traumatic experience is traumatic. So the person who's in the library reading a book about child abuse all of a sudden has a trigger, they have a stimulus, they have something that prompts their memory about a traumatic experience. But if someone hasn't had a traumatic experience, but they've had bad things happen to them in life, they can remember that. But by definition, it's not a traumatic experience. Maybe uncomfortable, maybe unpleasant, but it doesn't kick in the syndrome the way that a traumatic stressor does. Is it the fact that people who have been traumatized, who have something like post traumatic stress disorder, have an intense reaction at the recollection of the event or once that memory has kicked in? That's the distraction. Now, what is the next? We're done with. Are there only four things under B? No, there's five. There's one more. What's the fifth one? The fifth one is psychological reactivity on exposure to internal or external cues that resemble or symbolize an aspect of the traumatic event. Well, what does that mean? This is the counterpart to the B4. What it means is that the person has physiological arousal increase. They may sweat more, they may breathe more rapidly, they may find their hands clammy, they may find their muscles tight, they might find themselves feeling very keyed up and aroused. So it's physiological reactivity. You know, it's one form of physiological reactivity that's occurring upon exposure to cues that are either external or internal. So it can be sweating, perspiration, etc. Rapid heartbeat. Rapid heartbeat's coming. I'm just gonna chime in here and say I can attest to this when you get a PTSD trigger. Um, my triggers were like being in the area where my husband, my ex, and I were married and where we lived, things like that. Like if I'm in those areas, I get triggered, but otherwise, like I don't really think about them, and it's like a long distant past from my life, and I don't care to think about it at all. But I could get triggered sometimes by certain topics, maybe, or certain, more so like when I physically going into a space where I used to be with him, then it kind of creeps me out. All right, so rapid heartbeat is common. And all of these things are the way the person is reacting to nothing new happening, just flashing back to or remembering or being cued to a past trauma. It can be cued by something internal, their own thoughts, or it can be cued by something external. Now, whether it's cued internally or cued externally by a situation or stimulus or trigger, there's this psychological reactivity that is now manifest in their behavior that wasn't there before. But the whole B cluster of symptoms has to do with that component of PTSD that has to do with re experiencing past trauma. Yes. Involuntarily. Yes. And is that what distinguishes post traumatic stress disorder from? Is that one of the things that's required for post traumatic stress disorder that is, it's not necessary part of battered person syndrome? Yes. Can you give a diagnosis of someone with battered person syndrome if they don't have this re experiencing component? Yes, you could, but you can't find PTSD without it. That's correct. And in the literature having to do with abused people, are there many abused people who suffer from battered person syndrome who, because they lack this component or re experiencing, are not diagnosable as post traumatic stress disorder? Correct. Now, what's the next series of symptoms? Now, let me just ask you something. In order to render a diagnosis as a practitioner, when you look at this so called B cluster, the re experiencing cluster, do you have to find that the patient in question manifests all five versions of re experiencing before they meet the diagnosis? No. The manual requires one of the five symptoms. So only one. One or more, yeah. So if you had someone who, say, had most of the five choices and the most frequent way that they had re-experiencing was through these nightmares, that would satisfy the diagnosis? It would. In your evaluation of Eric Menendez, of these five which of these five forms of re-experiencing did you find the opinion that he manifested? All of them. Not just the nightmares, all of them. The disassociation, all of it. All of the physiological changes when he re-experiences these events. I hope he has been able to overcome this because that's got to be god awful. And what was that based solely on things he told you, or was that Was there information from other witnesses that corroborated that he was having these kinds of re-experiencing episodes? There's information from many witnesses that corroborates these symptoms. We're going to get to some of that later. Now, what is the C cluster? What is that type of symptom that is under the C cluster here in the DSM-5? 4. Sorry, I keep saying 5 because that's what's current and it's on my mind. It just flips off my tongue. Sorry. He says the C cluster basically is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. Oh, that's me. That's where I fall. I just try to avoid it. Nope, didn't happen. I forgot about it. Back in the past. I've moved on. That's me. The C cluster basically is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responses not present before the trauma, as indicated by 3 or 4 of the following. And there's 7 symptom clusters. Are you guys diagnosing yourselves at all at this point? If you have had experience of abuse in your life, I mean, I'm relating. I'm experiencing. I'm I'm diagnosing myself as I go along here. Maybe. Maybe not. So now I'd like you to just define and give some examples of what you mean by persistent avoidance of what was the first half of that? Stimuli. Stimuli. Persistent avoidance of things that stimulate memories of the trauma. Is that what that means? That's what it means. So staying away from things that might remind you? Correct. What was the second half that's also required? Numbing? A numbing of general responses not present before the trauma. A numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma. Well, when they say numbing of general responsiveness, does that mean you become less emotional? It could mean a lot of things. It could mean that the person loses their capacity to feel. It means that their capacity to experience a certain range of emotions may be diminished. That's me. My range of emotions is probably diminished after 2 episodes of, not episodes, 2 separate times in my life where I was surrounded by an abuser. So it may mean that the very specific type of feeling or emotion is unavailable to them. Or it also may mean that they have problems in controlling how the emotions are experienced. Just let it go. There's no point in dwelling on it. There's no point in being bitter or angry about it. Let it go. I've forgiven my mom. Mom, I love you. If you're, I know you're not watching, but uh, anything I said, I'm sorry, but it's fine. Like, I'm good. I've moved on, but I guess maybe I'm just avoiding it too. Well, how is a failure to control or problems controlling how emotions are experienced? How is that a form of numbing? Can you give me an example? Well, when I talk about earlier, I referred to affect modulation, this problem of control. Uh huh. So, one of the tendencies of people who have been traumatized, let me give you an example. They can alternate shutting down feeling what's happening to them. In other words, they don't want to experience what it was that they went through. They don't want to experience the pain. They don't want to experience the anxiety. They don't want to experience the depression or the fear, whatever the specifics for them are. So they shut it off. That's me. That's me. I'm shut off. They block that out. They constrict it. They don't want that feeling anymore. That's me. So they numb it. On the other hand, many people don't stay numb forever. Trauma victims don't stay numb forever. They have these episodes in which the numbing dissipates and they have these intense experiences of emotion, including the ones they're trying to avoid. Great. I've got that to look forward to. Are there outward signs of this by people engaging in what appear to be appropriate emotional states or overreacting emotional states? Is that what happens when the numbing wears off? Yes, you can have a person become hyper reactive or hypervigilant. Well, let's see. No, maybe that's different. Maybe I should not speak so fast. You said there were 7 ways in which this persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness demonstrates themselves. Correct. Eric was removing himself from the house on that weekend, well, a lot during that week, and that weekend especially, he wasn't home all day during the day. He left, he kept himself away from the threat or the stimuli, which was Jose. So that's another good way to look at it. And the numbing, okay. He says correct. Okay, could you tell us what they are? The first one, efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. And that's me. So, not talking about it, not talking about it, not wanting to deal with it, and not wanting to engage in conversations with other people about what one experienced in the trauma. I mean, I would, I don't care. I just don't want to, like, why dwell in it? It's the past. It is not just wanting to talk about your own trauma experiences, or is there also tendency to avoid the topic altogether? The topic as it pertains to the same category of trauma that you'd have. Trauma survivors often will talk to other people who have had different types of trauma. Well, let's assume that you have someone untreated, yes, and somebody who's been sexually molested. Let's say this someone is a preteen or a teenage boy, okay? Okay. Hypothetically, there's a history of this boy shying away from all discussions of sex. Is that kind of a thing that we're talking about? Exactly. Okay. What's the second of the 7 ways in which this particular symptom cluster can be demonstrated? Efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. Okay. What's the third? Inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. So you forget uh, parts or some of it. Now, why would you be able to or unable to remember it? I mean, what's the basic symptom cluster is avoiding stimuli and numbing. Yes. What does that have to do with memory? It has to do with memory because some people develop amnesia or an absence of memory for some components of what they've been going through in a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon at all. It's the absence of memory. Usually, the most horrifying, most difficult, most painful, or most conflicted aspect of what happened in the traumatic experience, this person literally removes it from their memory. That's what this is referring to here, an inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. So they can remember the trauma, they can remember some of the details, but they have hazy recollections or missing data about the worst of the worst. Is that fair to say it? Yes, that's a fair way to say it. So there may be some things that were even worse that happened to Eric that we don't know because he blocked them out. Think about that. About all the horrible things we know that Jose did to his kids. There could be more that are blocked out, perhaps. Next question. With respect to this in particular, with respect to Eric Menendez, do you have an opinion as to whether or not he experienced this partial inability to recall the worst of the worst by way of tortious sexual abuse? Torturous. That's torture. That is torturous. We keep it's a joke with the whole tortious. If you're following the Karen Reed case, Turtle Boy can't say tortious, so he calls it tortoise or something. I don't know because he's a turtle. Um, yes, was the answer. Did that strike that. In examining the notes that Dr. Vickery made back in starting in 1990, with respect to your opinion that there was this kind of partial amnesia for some components of the most horrifying and painful aspect of the sexual abuse that Eric Menendez underwent, is the material in Dr. Vickery's notes either consistent or inconsistent with your conclusion that this was a symptom that Eric displayed? It is inconsistent. Your Honor, are we going to take a break? The court says, all right, we'll take our recess and resume at 3:30. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume at 3:30. Recess was taken. We are now back. Okay, the defendants are out. Let's get the jury out, please. Court says the jury's out. You may continue cross-examination. That was the shortest break ever in court. Ms. Abramson says, "Thank you, Your Honor." Okay. We were talking before the break, Dr. Wilson. By the way, post traumatic stress disorder is in the DSM-IV has a number. All the disorders are given a code number. That's correct. And the code to post traumatic stress disorder is what? 309.81. We're talking about 309.81C, which is the second set of symptom clusters. And you indicated there are 7 different types of symptoms that have to do with persistence, avoidance, and numbing of responsiveness, correct? Correct. All right. And we've gone through first the efforts to avoid thoughts and feelings or conversations associated with the trauma. Is there some example of how this manifests itself so that it can be perceived from outside that PTSD victims commonly show? Well, sure. The most common way is a person simply doesn't want to talk about it. If someone brings up the conversation regarding a particular experience, like the Oklahoma City bombing, or if they bring up someone in the conversation mentions a friend who knew someone who had experienced child abuse, if the person that's in the room who's had the experience, they get uncomfortable, they don't want to talk about that sort of thing, they get up and leave. Were there are people were there are people I don't some of the mistakes made in these transcripts give me a migraine. Were there people suffering from this where they're not in therapy and encouraged to talk about it? Is there a pattern that indicates that people suffering from post traumatic stress disorder tend to not talk about the traumatic events? Yes. That is the pattern. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to engage in it. They get uncomfortable, anxious. They'll leave situations if somebody brings up the topic. They show marked stress and go out of their way to avoid encountering a situation or some place where that might happen to them. Is that part of the understanding of why so large a percentage of the Vietnam War vets would not discuss the war of traumatic events? That's one of the reasons. The other reason is they were often chastised for what they did in the war because they came back to a hostile and social political environment. Yes. They were blamed. Yes. Objection. Overruled. Now, with respect to molested children, are there reports in the literature that molested children tend not to talk about their experiences of molestation? Yes. And is this one of the post traumatic stress disorder possible reasons why that appears to be a pattern? Yes, it is. And is the same true of in populations of battered women that they tend not to discuss the battering experience? Yes. They're embarrassed and often feel ashamed and humiliated this has happened. There are other components of PTSD. That's correct. Other components you mentioned about the shame and the humiliation and embarrassment. Is that also the reason commonly believed why molested and abused children do not talk about it? That's correct. Is there also a tendency among adults who have been abused as children, come from abusive families, do not discuss their family life? Yes. Is it understood that a component of people who come from abusive families don't discuss this because it's socially something that's considered shameful? Absolutely. And scandalous? Yes. Is a component in the assessment of people who are suffering from battered person syndrome the sort of broader category also that they don't discuss the battering and abusive experiences? That's correct. Okay, going back to then the list of possible manifestations, the so called symptoms under the C cluster. What is the second of the 7? The second of the 7 efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. Is there any example you can give of that? Sure, there are lots of examples. One example for persons who have been abused in childhood is when they move out of their home. It's often very difficult for them to go back to the neighborhood or house because it triggers the bad memory. It triggers the bad feelings. Although sometimes that's accompanied by a kind of deep curiosity and wish to go back. But the stronger tendency is to just say, I don't want to go back and see the place again. So they disconnect with their roots, basically. Disconnect, correct. What is the third symptom? The one we talked about earlier. Inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. Is that a conscious act, the inability to recall, or is that something that's automatic? It's automatic. In fact, you can ask the person to try to recall what's happening, and they can't do it by definition. To digress for a moment, when you interviewed Eric Menendez, did he indicate to you that there were activities between himself and his father that he described under the category of quote rough sex? Yes. Did he indicate to you a span of 2 years when he believes those activities were occurring? Yes, he did. And do you recall what ages he was during those 2 years? Yes, 13 to 15, maybe 15 and a half. And compared with the description and details that he was able to give you about sexual molestation apart from rough sex, was there a difference in the amount of information that he relayed he had in his memory concerning the activities, the sexually abusive activities, those 2 years? Yes, there was. What was the difference? The difference was for the other types, sexual molestation that he reported to me, he had clear descriptions of how they occurred, what the onset was, what the nature of the activity was like, what kind of acts were engaged in between Mr. Menendez and Mr. Menendez, Eric and his father. When he described the rough sex, he was able to describe some of the details about it. That is what I will call the setting being what he additionally referred to as the dark days, of referring to the fact that his room was dark and there were candles placed around the room, that his father had a strange glazed look in his eyes. Was he doing some kind of like ritual or something? What the hell? I'm even more convinced about my theory that there's something going on in Jose's world that we're not aware of. But trying to recount a chronology of exactly when those things occurred and in what sequence and so on got difficult as to some of the particular details of what went on with each of these episodes of rough sex. He also described to me, in his own words, what I would call a dissociative reaction, out of body experiences. Holy shit. Ways in which he was trying to remove himself from the psychological and physical pain that he was experiencing during the rough sex episodes. I feel so bad. Like my heart just hurts for him. And I see like I picture him all like sad and like a injured dog on the stand. I'm not calling him a dog, but I'm just saying like he looks injured and broken to me when he does testify in the first trial. I think he did much better in this trial and kind of knew more about the psychological part of what was going on with him. So I think he did a little bit better in that way. But I just picture him being like so broken. And it just breaks my heart because I just feel for these boys. No one should ever have to go through what they went through. So he had these out of body experiences. And he described to you sensations and his perceptions that he had at the time where he saw himself as if from a distance. Is that what you mean by out of body? Yes, up in the corner of the room, in the closet, peering out of the closet, looking at himself and his father during the episode, but while viewing himself from a ceiling position, looking down on himself and his father in a disassociative, depersonalized state or out of body, if you will, looking at himself through as if peering out of the closet into the room where the sex was occurring with his father and himself. That there was a kind of vague unreality to all of this, and he reported it to me. There was a part of him that knew that was actually taking place, and there was a part of him that was in kind of a fog about exactly everything that was happening through those various episodes of rough sex between the ages of 13 and 15. And was that description that you have called a dissociative reaction or a dissociative state consistent with the way other people who are suffering from post traumatic stress disorder describe dissociative episodes during trauma? Every single patient I've ever treated who has history of sexual abuse has described similar reactions during the sexual abuse. Male or female makes no difference. They've all reported to me that they've had these out of body experiences, depersonalized episodes, removing themselves psychologically in one form or another in a manner absolutely consistent with what was reported to me by Mr. Menendez. So this is very common. Every single, did he say every single? Every single patient that he's ever treated with a history of sexual abuse has claimed an out of body experience, much like Menendez, Eric. That's so sad. Like you have to completely detach from your body in order to have that experience because it's so painful that you can't psychologically handle it. Anyways, apart from your own patients and the literature, does this happen to be a common thing for children who are being molested? Yes. In fact, it is the single most common thing for children who have been molested repeatedly, who have been molested with episodes of physical violence and threat, who have been molested in particularly per- pernicious ways. Ooh, that's a good word. We don't use that word very often. What do you mean by pernicious? He says evil, horrific, life threatening, brutalizing, torture, inflicting harm, doing damage to genitals. The most horrific imaginable types of abuse. That's in the literature. And we know unequivocally that the most severe consequences of that kind of abuse is the formation of multiple personality disorders, or what today is referred to in the DSM-IV as dissociative identity disorder. It is an extreme form of post traumatic stress disorder. You're not saying, though, that Eric Menendez suffers from that extreme form. No, I'm not. Did he report that he disassociated through all of the varieties of sex that he was forced to participate in? No, only the rough sex. Does it make sense to you that only during the most, whoa, sorry, that was the dog stretching. He's laying on my lap and he likes to stretch out. Does that make sense to you that only during the most painful part would he claim to disassociate? Yes, it does. So when we're looking at cluster 3 and it's talking about inability to recall, we're really talking about dissociation. It's partly dissociation and it's partly amnesia where there is no memory at all. Why would you have amnesia about some events? From the literature, we know that the amnesia occurs for some events, generally speaking, when they're either the most horrific experience. Oh my God, that was fucking crazy. Hold on. Sorry about that. I had a little or it's not little, but it's a like a whiteboard calendar. It's a magnet, but I have it like just kind of propped up on a shelf. It's not like magnetized to anything. So it just fell all of a sudden. It was really weird and was knocking everything over. So sorry. So the witness says, from the literature, we know that the amnesia occurs for some events, generally speaking, when they're either the most horrific experience that a person witnessed and they wish literally to blot it out of their memory. Or in some cases, amnesia is associated with head trauma. I have patients who have been in airplane crashes in which they were severely injured and they had head trauma as the plane crashed. And part of their amnesia is associated with what happened to them in the plane. So there's more than one etiology or cause of amnesia. Now, Ms. Abramson asks, if someone is experiencing some horrific trauma frequently over a period of, say, months or years of their life and are tending to disassociate, is there likewise a tendency that they would have amnesia about some other part of the event or some time period surrounding the events? Yes. And did Eric Menendez indicate to you in your interview with him that he had special difficulty in remembering anything very much about his whole 15th year? That is correct. He has he's blocked out much of his 15th year of life. He can't remember much of it. So when I say anything very much, you understand the question isn't limited to episodes of sexual abuse. It's just his daily activities, what he was doing, what that 15th year. Yes, he said to me, it's gone. And again, in examining the notes of his conversations starting in 1990 with Dr. Vickery concerning the rough sex and episodes of disassociation and the breadth of his memory concerning his 15th year, was the contents of those notes either consistent or inconsistent with the information he gave you about these events? It's inconsistent. Now, what is the next symptom description under the C cluster? It's C4. Markedly, not TNT, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. So probably less social. You don't do as much as you used to. You don't find enjoyment in the things you used to. That seems self-explanatory. If you used to go to the movies or you go out dancing or you go to eat a lot and you're traumatized, you tend to not do those things. That's correct. Even though those events don't relate to the trauma. That's right. Why is that? Generally, it's related to depression. The person is so absorbed in the trauma, so overwhelmed by what's happened to them, they really don't want to have much to do with the world, so to speak. So they lose interest in things that used to give them pleasure and enjoyment. That's the depressive component. Feeling blue, low, down in the dumps, sometimes wanting to take your own life, feeling life is not worth living. Sometimes feeling like they just don't have the energy to want to go out and do those things. Well, that's me all the time. I don't have the energy to go out and do anything most of the time. It doesn't make me, I don't think that that's from depression, but I don't know. And that's also related to the other cluster C, where they don't want to be in situations where someone asks you, how are you doing? Have you gotten over that plane crash? How are you coming in therapy with your child abuse? People rather stay away from it. Is there any evidence that you determined fit this? Is there any evidence that you determined fit this category in your evaluation of Eric Menendez? Yes. Do you have in mind what that was? Yes, specifically that he had diminished interest in the relationship with peers in school, that he had diminished interest in relationships with girlfriends until his high school years, that he had limited social activities with people in high school, that he really had all of his energy, so to speak, highly structured in specific activities, but stayed away from others that were anxiety generating for him. And social activities. You're talking about a specific period of his life after his sexual abuse became violent? Yes, that's correct. What was your understanding of the age at which the sexual abuse became violent? Became violent around 12, 13 years of age. And is it your understanding from his report that he withdrew socially during his junior high school years? Yes, indeed. Between 12 and 15. Yes, he did. And was there also a component of that withdrawal, as it was explained to you, that had to do with not just activities, but the fact that that was an age at which his peers were becoming increasingly interested in sexual activity? That's correct. He reported to me that his peers, his male peers in school, wanted to talk about sex, talk about sexual activities and girlfriends, and that made him really uncomfortable. And he felt more uncomfortable terminating the relationship with his friends than exposing himself to a situation where he had to talk about sex or listen to them talk about sex. So he dropped his friends basically so that he didn't have to talk about sex because it made him so uncomfortable. Clearly one of the DSM-IV signs. And again, is that something that you looked for information on in Dr. Vickery's notes as well? Yes. Was this information there consistent or inconsistent with your opinion? It's inconsistent. Now, the next symptom, number 5, what is that under the cluster, the C cluster? It's called feelings of detachment or estrangement from other people. Does that manifest itself in something other people can see? Sure. How does it manifest itself in ways other folks can see? Well, the detachment component means people don't want to be around other people. They're detached, want to be by themselves. Well, that's me. They may not want to be with their family, may want to just stay in their room, may not want to watch TV with others or do activities with other people. They prefer to be detached. They don't want to be associated around other people. They like to be isolated, like to be alone, and I mean physically isolate themselves. It's really common for people with PTSD from whatever origin to want to detach or pull away. That's totally me. This estrangement is another component of that. Estranged means to feel estranged. One feels estranged from others. One doesn't feel close to other people or may feel they don't have the capacity to talk to other people, to have normal conversations, or to engage other people in typical ways. So they have this inner sense of estrangement that leads them to detachment. If you had a history, say, of a person in order to assess whether someone has developed symptoms based on trauma, do you look to see whether possible what their behavior was like before the alleged traumatic event and what their behavior was like after? Yes. And in order to do that, when the trauma is onset in childhood, do you look to whatever portion of the childhood predates what we've called the traumatic events, which is the sexual abuse and the violent sexual abuse? Yes. And then look at the behaviors as the child is older, following a period of very violent sexual abuse. Yes, it's if that's the scenario, of course that's how you do it. And are you aware of information not coming directly from Eric Menendez concerning marked changes in his behavior where he goes to being withdrawn and a loner and a non-communicative and silent and where he was outgoing and nosy before? Yes. Does that description loner come up in a multitude of records concerning him? Certainly does. In layman's language, do people suffering from these traumatic events become what we would call withdrawn? Yes. Now, does that mean withdrawn all the time or just more withdrawn than before? More withdrawn than before the trauma. What's next? So I take it that with respect to C5, and we'll get back to the others, you do find that's a symptomology that Eric Menendez displayed. Yes. What's C6 is, what's 6, she says. C6 is restricted range of effect and gives an example in the book. It does not, I'm sorry, unable to have loving feelings. Is that one of the many restricted ways of effect? That's correct. Or affect, I think it's the affect part. You should know affect, like Affleck. Sorry, I don't know why that jumped into my mind. Anyways, so is that the one with the is that one of the many restricted types of affect? That's correct. What are others? It could be any affect: joy, happiness, sadness, anger, pain, terror. In other words, they can't show it, correct? It's constricted, their ability to express it, to manifest it, it is limited. And why is that? It's part of the shutting down response that people have to trauma. It's a kind of turning off the emotions as a safety valve. It's a way of feeling more comfortable with oneself. Often, it's an attempt to gain control over a world that now seems, for many trauma victims, unpredictable and hostile and chaotic. Hmm, that makes sense. That's why I do it. That's why I isolate myself from the world. If you limit how much you feel, you have a greater sense of control over what might happen to you, especially in terms of relationships to other people. It's a safer response. So, do people with post traumatic stress disorder have difficulty making commitment relationships? Not all of them do. That would be a mischaracterization. Many people, especially if untreated, will have difficulty in interpersonal relationships, especially intimate relationships. Well, that's sort of what I mean. Husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. Exactly. And the seventh of the symptomology of the C cluster, a sense of foreshortened future. It says in parentheses, does not expect to have a career, marriage, children, or normal lifespan. How would you know that someone felt that way? They'll tell you. And is it something you cannot that you can only get by asking the person? No, you can look at it in a number of ways. The most common form is the person will say, I don't think I'm going to live very long or have much of a life. That's the way I hear it from my patients all the time. There are other ways you can look at it, particularly in adolescent children who have post traumatic stress. Sometimes they live as if there's no tomorrow, and so they'll engage in behaviors such as drinking, sexual promiscuity, partying, living it up, living as if every moment is going to be their last because they may feel they don't have a very long future. Another example of this has come from cancer patients, children, and adolescents who have cancer with a diagnosis of terminal or untreatable cancer. Often it continues this incredible sense of a foreshortened future, and they engage in psychological behavior that indicates they're going to get it all today because maybe that treatment isn't going to work. So they drive wild and recklessly, all of those kinds of things and more. And that's the seventh one. That's the seventh one. Now, again, in order to render a diagnosis of PTSD, you have to find that the person has had some symptoms from this cluster, correct? Correct. How many from this cluster do you have to find? Three or more, right? Three or more, right? And how many of these in your opinion, did Eric have? At least six, I think seven, or Eric. Now, the final cluster, the D cluster, has to do with why don't you tell us what it has to do with? The category is persistent symptoms of increased arousal not present before the trauma, as indicated by 2 of 5 symptoms. So, this is an indication that there's a change in the physical state. These increased physiological arousal or psychological arousal. It can be either one actually, and the person has to have 2 of 5 symptoms that define this. When you say physical, this isn't because this is a physical event. I'm sorry, this isn't a physical effect on a physical trauma. That's correct. It could be physical trauma, but it clearly can be psychological as well. This is a physical manifestation, isn't it, of a physical condition? Correct. Okay, so when you talk about arousal in the sense of post traumatic stress disorder for people who have experienced life threatening events or events that are perceived as terrorizing or life threatening, do they have a different day to day sense of fear and threat? Many people do, yes. And this state of arousal, is this a negative state? In other words, you can be aroused and extremely happy all the time? No, we're talking about a negative state of physiological arousal. So, what are emotional equivalents of this negative state? How would you describe the emotions that people are aroused into they are aroused into in this state? Blah. It's hard to say. Sorry. The most common language that I would use is a person feels keyed up, on edge, edgy, tense, irritable, jumpy, nervous. Maybe they have this strong sense of anxiety that something might happen at any time. It also includes an emotional sense of maybe you better be on edge or be on the lookout that something bad could happen to you. Those are simple ways of talking about it. Let's talk about the way we're describing under D. D cluster has 5 different expressions of symptoms of increased. Yes. What are they? The first one is difficulty falling or staying asleep. What's the second? The second one is irritability or outbursts of anger. This means outbursts of anger that are not connected to any rational cause. Yes. And let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say, hypothetically, someone has been taking tennis training from a particular coach for 5 years, and he's always been conforming and obedient and following instructions and well behaved on the court. And then at the same time that he's going to experience I think she means torturous sexual activity. They spelled it wrong. Torturous sexual activities. He starts to display irrational behaviors that appear to be anger or irritability, but just make no sense. Slamming balls around, not obeying instructions. Would that be an example of this kind of outburst of anger that's tied to the traumatic event? Yes. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not Eric Menendez manifested precisely what I just described in the hypothetical based on the materials that you examined in this case? Yes, I do. And yes, he did. Do you have an opinion as to whether Eric Menendez manifested precisely what I just described? Yes, and yes. Poor Eric. And like you say, like I feel so bad for him. He had what he went through is something I hope he is able to recover from. Truly. And I know his talking about it, speaking about it, and helping others in prison and, getting involved that way, that's great. And hopefully that is helping him to recover. Because talking about it actually does help you, in fact. Harping on it and just sitting on that anxiety, that doesn't help. Was it reported by a person whose testimony from the last trial you watched on videotape? Yes, it was. Objection, motion to exclude under Evidence Code 352. I can't hear you, says the court. Mr. Khan repeats, motion to exclude under Evidence Code Section 352. Objection sustained. The answer stricken at this point. Ms. Abramson says, okay. First of all, informing the conclusions that you've previously given us so far about the 2 diagnoses for Eric Menendez, and which of these symptoms he manifested, were you basing that just on what he told you? No. Did you have much paperwork submitted to you in this case? Yeah, a lot. Did that paperwork in part consist of both the interview statements and the sworn testimony of witnesses in this case? It did. Witnesses who testified at the first trial? It did. As well as some witnesses who testified in this trial? Yes. And in order to assist you in making some opinions or conclusions about the credibility of those witnesses, did you ask to see videotapes or to see videotapes of their testimony so that you could see their demeanor? I did. Did you receive videotapes of almost all of the witnesses who testified for the defense in the first trial? Yes, I did. And was the source of the information that led you to the opinion and conclusion that Eric Menendez had one of these outbursts of irritability, of anger related to traumatic stress, a person whose testimony you read, but who you also saw on videotape? That's correct. Now, the third symptom under the D cluster. Difficulty concentrating. Oh my gosh, I have that super bad. I mean, I can focus, like my ADHD, which I've never been diagnosed officially, but I think I have it. And I think it's adult onset ADHD too, because I never had it before. So it's wild, but I can't concentrate either. But it could be part of maybe this now. Maybe I don't have ADHD. Maybe it's part of my PTSD from my previous events in life. And is interference, concentration, or ability to concentrate a particularly common symptom of PTSD order? PTSD? Yes, it is. And is that an explanation for why there is difficulty to concentrate? Yes. What is it? There are several explanations for why persons with PTSD have difficulty concentrating. First and foremost, they may be experiencing the trauma. They have intrusive thoughts, traumatic memory. They have distressive feelings, emotions that well up as they relive what they experienced during the traumatic event. When that occurs, it interferes with their concentration and attention because they focus inwardly about the emotional arousal or the emotional flooding that they're experiencing or preoccupied with the visual traumatic imagery, which is very upsetting and something that commands their attention. When that occurs, when they have these intrusive processes, that takes away their capacity to concentrate. That's one of the reasons that that's there. There are other reasons as well that suggest that one of the disruptions that occurs in post traumatic stress disorders is a change in the way the brain processes information. So, all of this, I mean, this has to come in. The physiological, the neurobiological stuff that they don't want in, it has to. All of this stuff changes your brain, and this dude is testifying to it. So they have to be able to bring it in. Well, you know how the judge is, but we'll see. So there is a very technical explanation. I won't go into detail on it other than to say that once this condition exists, this change in state, this brain state affects the person's capacity to take in information the way they did before. And once that occurs, it impairs their ability to concentrate and to retain information and memory as well. Oh, great. That's why my memory sucks too. So we have this attention shift with preoccupation and traumatic memory. And we have a change in the mechanism in the brain to put it in simple terms. And is one of the most common symptoms, although it's not expressed that way here in the DSM-IV, but is there expressed in the literature a common difficulty with short-term memory? Yes. That's one of the supporting symptoms for PTSD? Yes, indeed it is. And difficulty in short term memory means what? That the person has difficulty remembering things from the recent past or the immediate past in terms of being focused on a task on the here and the now. And with respect to this area of difficulty concentrating, is there information in the materials provided to you that leads you to concentrate that Eric Menendez had repeated and pervasive word persuasive wanted to come out, so I stopped it. Pervasive concentration problems? Yes, he did. And in addition to that, he had problems with short term memory. Is that information based on sources other than himself? Yes, it is. Do you view that information as a symptom of PTSD? Yes. With respect to that in particular, was there one body of material submitted to you that contained the greatest amount of information about these concentration difficulties? Yes. What was that? The body of information came from the Lewis School. This is a school that Mr. Menendez attended in 1989. Let me ask you this generally. Yes? We haven't gone through this listing yet. Uh huh. Did you have provided to you the best you could ascertain all of Eric Menendez's school records from kindergarten through Beverly Hills High School? Yes. With respect to those school records, did you have the records from Princeton Day School or a PDS, as they tend to call it? Yes, I did. And being a private school, did PDS generate a great deal of written material about Eric Menendez? Yes. Based on your experience, was the kind of written material generated at PTSD far more extensive than what is ordinarily generated in a public school? Yes. Was there, from what you could determine, at least 4 written reports each semester that were sent home for each student? For each of the quarters during the academic year, correct. Did you read all of those materials prepared by the teachers? Yes, I did. And did you also read interview statements with some of Eric Menendez's teachers at PDS? Yes, I did. Did you also read this testimony of Sandra Sharp, Spanish teacher? I'd make a motion to exclude her under Evidence Code Section 352, says Mr. Khan. Court says, at this point, there's been no reference to the content, just the fact that he read something. Ms. Abramson says, exactly. The court says, overruled. Thank you, Your Honor. The witness says, yes, I did. Ms. Abramson says, did you, with respect to Mrs. Sharp, also view her videotaped testimony? Yes, I did. Did you also read the interview and view the videotaped testimony of Eric Menendez's ninth grade English teacher, Barbara Howarth? Yes, I did. Did you also read and view the videotaped testimony of another Spanish teacher from PDS named Alicia Hertz? Yes, I did. In addition to these three teachers, whose testimony you read, you were also there. Were there also interviews? Sorry, were there also interviews with other teachers who did not testify? Yes, there were at least, as I sit here, I can remember about a half dozen at least. Yes. Were there notations bearing on this issue of difficulty in concentrating, difficulty in short-term memory from other teachers whose existence you know because they signed on the reports from the school? Yes, the most remarkable thing to me about those records is that perhaps, with one exception, every single teacher at the Princeton Day School made comments about this. About concentration problems? Yes. And short-term memory problems? Yes. Is anxiety, perceived anxiety, anxious behavior, expressions of anxiety a symptom or potential symptom of PTSD? Sure. Where does it? I don't see it here. Where is it in this cluster? It's assumed. It's an anxiety disorder. Do we start with the notion that at a very minimum, a person suffering from PTSD is a highly anxious person? That's correct. And in those records and information from Eric Menendez's school years, is there repeated observations of him being anxious? Yes, there are. Extremely anxious? Yes. Are there behaviors that are reported in those notes and reported in statements from these witnesses that he engages in anxious behavior such as crying? Yes. I would object. Calls for hearsay. Motion to exclude under Evidence Code 352. The court says you're mumbling. Motion to exclude under Evidence Code 352. Objection is overruled. It will remain. The witness says the answer is yes. Ms. Abramson says, and is the information concerning crying indicating a linkage between his crying when he is frightened? Objection. The witness says yes. Calls for hearsay. Sustained. The answer is stricken. Ms. Abramson says, is there any indication that he cries to gain sympathy? Objection. Calls for speculation. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, are there descriptions of crying episodes, even when he's 15 and a half years old, concerning fear of being given examinations or fear of receiving poor grades? Objection. Calls for hearsay. Sustained. He read through his his stuff, so why wouldn't he be able to answer that? Or it's an if you know question, might be. Your Honor, I'd like to be heard on this. Okay, we'll do that a little later. Miss Abramson says, okay, about 15. Now, the fourth category of symptoms under the arousal cluster, the D cluster, is what? Hypervigilance. Here we are, folks. Hypervigilance. It's a weird one. We have a whole separate chart here on hypervigilance, which, of course, none of us can read. What is hypervigilance? I need some water before I start reading his answer. I'm sure it's going to be long. He says, hypervigilance refers to hyperscanning. It's being on the lookout to the extreme, scanning the environment for danger, looking for threats, being keyed up, being very attuned to nuances and one's situation, one's world, looking for subtle clues that may tell you that something is about to happen. And is hypervigilance a significant symptom factor when you're dealing with people with post-traumatic stress disorder who are fearful due to attack or harm from another person? Absolutely. And this, I take it, would include that whole class of Vietnam War vets, domestic Vietnam vets, and abused children, and many more, yes. People who have been harmed by other people rather than by national disasters. That would intensify, but seriously could happen from national disasters as well.
So one of the manifestations of this anxiety disorder is being anxious about when something bad is going to happen again. That's right. Is that a fair way to put it? That's a fair way to put it. When you say you scan the environment for cues of what? Cues that signal something bad is going to happen. And is it just a free floating bad is it just a free floating bad going to happen, or bad is going to happen like happened before? That has happened before. So you're afraid of your past fears that have already happened to you. You're afraid of them repeating. It's tied to the trauma. The cues are often trauma specific. Well, give us some examples, if you can, in different areas of what is a traumatic specific cue. Sure. Let me give you a couple of examples. I had a number of patients a few years ago who were hotel fire survivors, and this was a disastrous fire that consumed a hotel. And those who survived had to go to the top and be airlifted off. And this lasted for several hours. Afterwards, many of the people, understandably, didn't want to go to the hotels, but those who did go to hotels insisted on staying on the first floor. They wanted to have their rooms located next to the exit routes of the door in the hotel. Um, they often wanted a room on the inside corridor if there were more than one corridor in the interior. Some of my patients, when first interviewed, when I first interviewed them, I interviewed them at the hotel as part of a lawsuit, and they would come into the room in which they were doing the interviewing, and they would immediately walk over the window to look how could they get out. They went to the bathroom, checked the windows and doors. They went out the doors of the hotel room to count how many steps it was to find the exit route. That's one example of hypervigilance in the extreme. How come? Say, compared to automobile accidents, how common are hotel fires? They're pretty rare. Yet these people are spending all of this time trying to prevent being caught in another hotel fire? Yes. Is that is that normal to be that cautious? If you've had a trauma, it's been normal because it becomes adaptive to be in the lookout for that kind of situation. So it's normal to them. Not maybe, I mean, it doesn't make sense necessarily to other people, but it might be normal to them. Just to focus on this, are people who have post traumatic stress disorder abnormal people? No. And even though they have these symptoms, which are not the way untraumatized people react, does having these symptoms make them abnormal? No. Why? The court says, what do you mean by abnormal? Ms. Abramson says that's exactly what we're getting into. Court says, what do you mean by abnormal? Like not normal? Witness says, by abnormal, Your Honor, we're referring to the fact that they may have a classic psychiatric disorder, a bona fide mental disorder that needs, for instance, schizophrenia, a thought disorder, or a bipolar disorder. That's traditionally the definition of a mental illness. Post traumatic stress disorder, in that regard, is not abnormal. It's an environmentally caused disorder. The symptoms are tied to an environmental event which is traumatic. The development of the symptoms, although they can impair function, are qualitatively different than the kinds of illness than we traditionally see. The court says the behavior of that individual is different than the person or than a person who hasn't gone through those experiences. Yes, says the witness. The court says perceptions and behavior different than a person who suffers from PTSD. That's correct. The court says, we'll be in recess until tomorrow morning. There are some matters that counsel and I have to discuss, so don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions and don't about it. We'll resume tomorrow at 8:30. I think I dropped something. I don't know why they put that stuff in the record, but it makes me laugh every time because it's so out of place. Court says, okay. Oh, so let me pause here so I can get my timestamp. All right, so the court says there's some matters that you wanted to discuss before. Are the jurors ready to leave now, or do they need some time? As far as the subject of the physical responses to post traumatic stress disorder or battered, jury exits the courtroom. Court continues, person syndrome. I have the material submitted by the defense. Did you have anything you wanted me to look at in that regard? It seems to me from that material supplied that there is a sufficient basis for the defense to go forward with this testimony, and it would be more appropriate to be dealt with by rebuttal evidence by the prosecution if you have to, rather than subject to a 402 hearing. We won? We won? We won. Is that real? We won. Okay, I think. I think. I mean, we get to talk about some of the PTSD neurobiology stuff and battered syndrome, battered spouse syndrome. Mr. Khan says the court is referring to what materials that have been submitted. The court says, I'll let you look at it. Mr. Khan says, we have a copy of the articles. The court says, it just seems to me that there is a sufficient basis for them to explore the area, both of physical, as to physical reaction to trauma, and then if you have some countervailing evidence, it could be offered in rebuttal. Mr. Khan says, okay, we'll do that. So if you remember, I think it was the last episode, he wanted a hearing. He's like, this is ridiculous. We can't let this in. We can't let physical changes to the body in. It's just impossible. And his arguments were ridiculous. So that was yesterday. And now, thank goodness, finally the court was like, okay, well, is there some materials you can give me to look over about this neurobiological change that happens so that I know that, I'm not precluding an expert that is actually an expert on something that he knows what he's talking about. So he actually, Ms. Abramson gave them materials, and apparently he was maybe able to look at it during the break there and realized it's sufficient enough. There's medical journals, medical articles, papers, things, books of that nature that are all scientific. And I mean, this has been a science. Psychology has been a study for years of people's behaviors. So we should know this. This isn't new stuff. Court says, as far as the psychiatric or psychological examination of the defendant, Ms. Abramson says, before we get to that, could we just resolve the issue? I wanted to be heard on this. It's very brief. Sure, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, okay, here's the point. In Dr. Wilson's opinion, the behavior of Eric Menendez that was observed by Barbara Howarth and Sandy Sharp and many other teachers, even at 15 and a half, he's extremely anxious. He cries when he knows an exam is about to be given. He is clearly fearful of not getting a good grade. Is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder as manifest by him. It's so pervasive in the school records that it rises to the level of not just emotional conduct, but a true symptom. Court has precluded us from calling the witnesses who can testify to this. How do I prove the symptoms if I can't call the witnesses who can testify to it? Fine. The other way is by allowing my expert to indicate what it is he's relying on in informing his conclusion that my client manifested that symptom. And that's all I was trying to do. So I think once I've identified, I'm not asking, I'm really trying to be good, Judge, which I know is unusual for me. But when I am trying to be good, I'm really trying to be good. And there are these specific things that appear. That's why that's why I'm taking all this time to go through the list so the court will understand what kinds of things are symptoms of this behavior or disorder so that I have a right to show there's a factual basis for this conclusion rather than just get off into the stratosphere about everything we ever proved up. Court says, this is the totality of the reference, then, to the contents of the testimony of these witnesses that the witness will be referring to? I think the anxiety part was, says Ms. Abramson, the anxiety, fear part, they were symptoms witness. They were symptom witnesses. Isn't that it? Dr. Wilson says, with them, it is sure. The court says, all right, I'll permit it. We won. I'm like shocked at this. I think because he knows it would be an error to not allow them to talk about it. I mean, he still made plenty of other errors along the way, but Ms. Abramson says, thank you, Your Honor. The court says, it seems to me the reason I sustained the objection was it was too conclusionary, and I don't recall her testimony was that specific that they can say this was the cause and effect, more that it was associated with taking of tests and results of tests or something to that nature. Ms. Abramson says, actually, what they testified to is he was highly anxious just knowing a test was going to be given. It wasn't he was anxious or crying just because he got a bad grade. It was the very fact a test was going to be given. It's real anxiety. The court says, okay, not sympathy getting. The court says, let's go to the issue of the examination of the defendant. Ms. Abramson says, yes, Your Honor, here's our only concern. Well, we have lots of concerns. Here's all we're requesting at this time. First of all, we still don't have a clue what the actual scope of this examination is or what its purposes are. And we believe, under at least Estelle versus Smith, that we're entitled to know what the purposes are so we can properly advise our clients as to how to conduct himself in the course of these interviews and so that we can spend some time preparing him for this interview process. Now, as the court knows, he has been on the witness stand until today for 15 days. There was a Christmas break, but the pressure and the stress doesn't go away, and when you know you're still on the witness stand. So he has been under a great deal of stress. We would like to accommodate Dr. Dietz, and we do not intend to instruct him to refuse this interview if the court was wondering he is going to participate in this interview. We would like to simply get him ready, and we haven't had a chance since we've all been here and he's been on the witness stand to deal with what the scope of this interview might be. We'd also like to know what the scope of the interview might be. We have no information whatsoever on. We'd also like to furnish materials to Dr. Dietz. We have no idea what he has. He doesn't return our phone calls. We've been trying to find out what was submitted to him, and the people haven't told us. So we would like just some of that information, and we'd like a couple days to discuss it with our client. Hold on, the dogs want to go out. I'm going to have to pause again to go get them because the air's on, but we can keep going for a while. I don't anticipate that the defense case is going to end given what's going to happen next week and then Dr. Wilson's return and the scheduling of our other witnesses. I mean, the people are at least in the end of their fourth week of this month, which gives them 2 weekends to conduct these interviews or more. I mean, honestly, I believe it would be more, but I don't know how many hours they're still intending to conduct this. It is our understanding now that our agreement to this is in part because the people have assured us that that it is going to be videotaped, and we would also like some ground rules. Okay, about the turning over of the videotapes to us expeditiously so that we can view them and prepare for them. The other thing is, because they are going to be videotaped, we also want to make arrangements for the sheriff's department so our client can be wearing civilian type clothes instead of the creepy, scary looking jail stuff, since those videotapes may become evidence in the trial. So we just need a couple of days, Your Honor, for arranging and being able to talk to your client. Court says, how long is it that you expect the interview to take place or to consume? How much time? Mr. Khan says, I believe we can do it in 2 days, Your Honor. Court says, I was thinking of Sunday and Monday because we have a 3-day weekend here. Mr. Khan says, yes. The court says, and giving the defense Saturday, and between now and the end of the day Saturday to do what preparation you need. Ms. Abramson says, we'd like to have some parameters of how many hours of interview at a time so our client isn't put in a position where he 12 hours later and without having gone to the bathroom or gotten any food or had medication or any of those things, that this be done on a human scale. Court says obviously it will be done in a humane fashion, one that would conform with the purpose for which it's being done to obtain valid information. As far as the videotaping, we had discussed that before and have arrangements yet been made for that. Mr. Khan says, I'm sorry. Court says, have arrangements been made for the videotaping? Mr. Khan says, we'll speak to Dr. Dietz and find out how that can be done. The court says the sheriff's department is the one that would have to do it. I don't know if they're willing to do it or require some other person to be involved in the videotaping. Those things have to all be arranged. And basically, as far as the court time to do it, you have between now and the end of the day tomorrow to make those arrangements. And my suggestion is it be done by arrangement of counsel and that you confer against yourselves as far as the details of it, and that it's ensured that it will be accomplished and assured that copies will be made available to the defense in a timely fashion. That was a long ass weird sentence. Mr. Khan says, okay. Court says, as far as the scope of the interview and the nature of the interview, is he proposing to do psychological testing during this interview? No, no psychological testing, just interview, says Mr. Khan. Court says, just meeting with and getting information from the defendant? Mr. Khan says, yes, Your Honor. The court says, okay. Ms. Abramson says, beyond that, we'd like to know what the purposes are for whether there's any purpose here to use this information for a potential penalty phase or just a guilt phase. The court says, well, this was, as I understand it, for the purpose of obtaining information to refute the diagnosis of the defense experts who are testifying in the guilt phase of the trial. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Abramson says, may Mr. Levin also say something? The court says, sure. Mr. Levin says, although the courts ruled uh, we don't have a right to be present in the interview room, should have a right in some fashion, like a grand jury, where we could be present someplace where Mr. Menendez can make contact with us. The court says, sure. If there is a need by the defendant to confer with counsel, there should be a mechanism available for that, whether you want to do it by telephone or by your presence outside in some fashion. The defendant clearly has a right to confer with his counsel. If it appears it's just a ruse to interfere with the progress of the examination and to prevent it from progressing, then it would certainly constitute, in my view, refusal to be subject to examination. So he's already like speculating that Eric's not going to cooperate and he's going to constantly be like, I'm going to go talk to the lawyers just to like not do the exam. What? Okay, Judge. Mr. Levin says, it would be my intention to have myself as Ms. Abramson be physically present at some location where, if it became necessary to confer with our client, that the sheriff's department would be able to come to some pre-designated location and get us. That's all. The court says, I would suggest it would be nowhere near where the examination is conducted for the obvious reason. That close proximity could be construed as a mechanism to interfere. Samerson says, it isn't because the psychiatrists are allowed inside the Sally port and the security part of the jail and we aren't. Court says, okay. Samerson says, if they use the 650 room, which is what they usually use, the closest we could be is outside the visiting area, the hospital side of the jail. That's as good as it gets. Court says, I think the defendant has a right to have access to his lawyers during such an examination. Ms. Abramson says the other thing, though, Your Honor, is that I think it would be appropriate at this time because we want to make sure that Dr. Dietz has available to him all relevant materials for the people to give us some indication of what it is that he has at this point. Court says, I don't think that's necessary. If they intend to call him, I don't think it's necessary at this stage. Ms. Emerson says, yes, that is true, Your Honor. In order to make the interview humane and to accomplish the purpose for which ostensibly it is being held, we'd ask that the court direct the sheriff's department not to have our client in waist chains and restraints during this interview. It's very hard to do psychological interviews in restraints. Our own experts have had to go through dialogue, shall we say, with the sheriff's department to make sure when they interview Eric, he wasn't chained up, and he never is after the dialogue is completed. But I don't know if Dr. Dietz will have the same interest and would insist, as our experts do, that Mr. Menendez not be chained up on when the conversation. So we are asking that it be conducted in such a way, in such a place, that Mr. Menendez is not chained up or otherwise cuffed. They do have these rooms where they can put him inside like 650, and they don't need to do that. Court says, okay. I don't know the specifics of the jail needs. And my suggestion is that between now and the end of the day tomorrow, you try to work out the specifics. I really have no way of dealing with that in the abstract, but I think that counsel should get going on this so that it can be accomplished. Let me reiterate that the absence of counsel and the availability of counsel to speak with the defendant should not be utilized as a mechanism to defeat the purpose of the examination, which is to provide the prosecution expert with similar opportunity to examine the defendant as has the defendant expert or the defense expert. And if it's construed by, or if it appears that the opportunity to speak with counsel is being used just for the purpose of defeating the purpose of the examination, then certainly the people would be entitled to appropriate remedies. Ms. Abramson says, of course, that's the beauty of videotape. You'll see what we're doing too. Court says, that's true, but the best way to deal with it is to keep it in mind. The people have the right to this examination, and it shouldn't be interfered with any more than the defense has had anything interfered with regarding to its exams and interviews and the defendant or other witnesses. Anything else now on that subject, I expect that tomorrow we'll have some more discussions on this to iron out the details. And I suggest that you speak among yourselves, both sides, to see if you can work it out. Ms. Abramson says, I don't know what groundwork the people have laid with the sheriff's department. I've never had anything videotaped at the jail. I have no idea who their contact is. Court says, I have no information about that. Whatever obstacles there are, you'll have to deal with that. She's like, I don't know. You do it. You do it. Just don't bother me and your stuff. Let me know if there's something the court can do, but don't bother me. But let me know if there's anything I do. We'll be in recess until tomorrow. Mr. Levin says, one more scheduling issue tomorrow morning. It's our intention, if allowed, to take a witness out of order, and that would be Dr. Hamlin Emery. I would be examining him. It's approximately a 15-20-minute direct. Dr. Emery has no other available time slot to be present in court. The court says, what is he testifying to? Mr. Levin says Dr. Emery would be testifying to the same issues and facts he testified to in the first trial. He has. Oh, I got to go let the dogs in. Hold on one second. He's a psychiatrist from Westlake, where Mrs. Menendez was brought in for treatment following an apparent overdose on November the 8th, 1987. He continued to treat her and prescribe medication to her for the period of November of 87 to October of 88, and that the purpose of this is to corroborate certain information that Mr. Menendez stated on the 12/11 tape regarding his mother's wanting to take her own life testimony. He's offered both on direct and cross concerning that issue and the depression pills that he was taking, etc. The court says people wish to be heard. Ms. Nahara says, yes, Your Honor. I don't believe that whether or not his mother wanted to take her own life was, the court says she didn't. Ms. Abramson says we wouldn't be here. Attempted to. She continues on, Ms. Nahara, was gone into at all by Mr. Khan, I believe, and I'll go and look at my understanding is the court has previously ruled that Dr. Emery Cox and I believe a third doctor has been ruled inadmissible. I don't believe anything new has been added. I think we filed a motion dealing with all three doctors, and it's my understanding the court ruled on that motion and that they would be excluded from this trial. Mr. Levin says, Your Honor, I know Ms. Nahara wouldn't say anything intentionally that she didn't actually believe. Dr. Emery testified in front of both juries, I believe both juries, on November the 15th, 1993, and I can direct Ms. Nahara to the pretrial discussion concerning that admissibility of those doctors. The court did rule that Dr. Emery could testify, and the court's discussion, although I don't have the volume, begins at page whatever of the previous volume. The court says, "We had a hearing in this trial." Mr. Levin says, "I'm sorry." "Before the trial started," the court says. Ms. Nahara says, "I believe in this trial he was ruled inadmissible, Your Honor." Court says, "Yes, the testimony of Emery was. On the other hand, it's on the record. I don't have the transcript here, but this was discussed before the trial began, and the court ruled it would not be admissible." Ms. Abramson says, "I think the people put on the 1211 tape and questioned our client in such a way as to indicate that the information that was giving on the tape was truthful. I mean, there were a whole series of questions about why would you go in there and talk to them and not tell them the truth? This was really to be used in litigation, that kind of thing, and therefore giving the inference that what our client is saying or what he is adaptively admitting by way of his brother's statements or Dr. Oziel's statements about when his mother wanted to take her own life and when she was depressed, and is on tape and is on that tape true. And in his testimony, he indicated that one of the reasons he suggested that what's on that tape cannot be believed because it's not true. It makes no sense. Factually, any behavior of her wanting to take her own life on her part did not occur in 1989. Around the time of the homicides, Dr. Emery was the witness who can prove when it was that she was taking her own or wanting to take her own life. Beyond that, Dr. Emery can also prove one of the things that Eric Menendez testified to about her condition on August the 20th. On August the 17th, he indicated that she appeared to be loaded or drugged or drunk when he encountered her in the den that Thursday night. And we have drug records that Mr. Emery can authenticate that show she was taking, over the course of the preceding 2 years, enormous quantities of Xanax and imipramine, was a regular user of enormous amounts of medication. The fact is that Dr. Cox, in his notes and in his previous testimony, verifies that she had an enormous capacity and took a lot of drugs as well as drinking. Dr. Summerfield's notes indicate the same thing, and I say that, Your Honor, because to establish that what you're trying to prove is the truth, that is an obvious truth. We're not going to get into character or her compliment or her complaints or any of that, but merely to prove what was the date of the suicide of the taking her own life behavior to corroborate or our client that it was not 1989, to corroborate him in his description of finding the letter at a particular time period after they came to California, and to corroborate that she was taking a great deal of medication, and that's all it's for. Of course, is okay. Does Emery know anything about the letter? Does he know anything about the state of sobriety on August the 17th? Emery doesn't know, but Cox does. If that's a reason to call the witness, I'll call Cox. Court says, "I'm just talking about the offer of Emery. Let me say this. The only relevance to any of the evidence of the psychologist or psychiatrist who treated Mrs. Menendez would have to do with the issue of whether or not she wanted to take her own life in 89, not whether or not she wasn't wanting to take her life in 87. That doesn't refute or corroborate the defendant's testimony. The issue is his description of the December 11th tape that she wanted to take her own life in 89, and the defense testimony is that she was not wanting to take her own life in 89. So if there's some evidence the defense can offer to corroborate his testimony that she wasn't wanting to take her own life in 1989, I'd consider that. I don't see how Emery's testimony is something. Miss Abramson says, I think he would say that by the time he completed treating her in 1980, she was not wanting to take her own life. The court says we're talking about 1989, which was when her life was taken, when was whether she was or was not wanting to take her own life at that time. Its only relevance has to do with whether the December 11th tape accurately reflected her condition at that time by description of the defendants. Ms. Abramson says, does that mean that we'd be permitted to call Dr. Summerfield to testify for that limited purpose that he was treating her in 89 and he would say that she was not wanting to take her life at that time? The court says if you have a witness who would say that, I'd consider it. The Emory offer doesn't meet the issue. Ms. Amerson says, but the jury, based on what they heard, could assume that the defendant is lying about her ever attempting to take her life. These records prove. The court says he wasn't testifying about these attempts. Ms. Amerson says, yes, it's the only one we know about. The court says, I don't see the relevance. As I said, the only relevance that arose by the playing of the December 11th tape had to do with whether she was or was not wanting to take her own life in August of 89 when the defendants on the tape described her in that condition of being sedated. If there's some evidence to refute that, I'll consider that as appropriate corroborative evidence. Samerson says the problem is they are talking about an attempt, and the attempt that we know of was 1987. If the people are prepared to stipulate that the attempt was 87, and we have the Westlake Hospital records, fine. But I think we should be entitled not only to prove, one, that she was not wanting to take her own life in 89, but also the other half, which is that when they were talking about her wanting to take her own life, and the attempt they were talking about was in 1986 and 87, which we have proof of. The court says there was a medical record that was discussed as an exhibit. If you want to find that one, we can review that. Mr. Levin says it was 336 and 37. Court says, I don't find Emery's testimony. Levin says there is one additional point, and it has to do with family secrecy. There was a rather unusual situation with respect to Dr. Emery in treating patients in his psychiatric practice. He tried desperately to ascertain the etiology of Mrs. Menendez's problems. He questioned her. He was baffled. He could not find out from her why she was so depressed, why she expressed symptomology that she had. Dr. Emery called Dr. Summerfield, and the two of them, after a conference, agreed essentially that Mrs. Menendez was. Dr. Emery would testify that he felt, when taking the psychological history of Mrs. Menendez, that she was trivializing her circumstances, that she did take an overdose, and she was quite frightened. He would go as far as say she was very secretive concerning the nature of the problems that she suffered. And we feel that that is essentially for the defense to prove the secretive nature of the Menendez family, that she had a doctor-patient relationship with a psychiatrist. She's in acute distress, yet she will not tell her psychiatrist even when she is asked what it is that she's suffering from. And Dr. Emery, although he felt quite uncomfortable, continued to prescribe her exceptionally high doses of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, where he continuously upped the dosage to the point where she had taken over a 16-month period over almost 5,000 pills of Xanax and imipramine, and these doses were continually upped. Almost 5,000 pills? So I think that that's essential to the defense, and it's corroborative of Eric Menendez with respect to, one, the mother having the depression that he witnessed in her at the time, and two, the fact that Mr. Menendez would not tell her psychiatrist the problem, Mrs. Menendez. And we feel that this is exceptionally not only important testimony, but it's very relevant in that it all occurs just in 10 months prior to her death. Court says, okay, weighing this evidence. Under Section 352 of the Evidence Code, bearing in mind that the issues here are the mental states of the defendant at the time he killed his parents, I find that whatever marginal probative value there is and there's almost none, it's substantially outweighed by its potential for prejudice and confusion of issues, and therefore the objection is sustained. All right, we'll be in recess until tomorrow, 9:30. He's just like, sustained. Bye. Ugh. Okay. So I'm not gonna break it down. We went through a lot, and I did this all mostly in like with no breaks. So we learned a lot about what happens to people when they've been in a traumatic situation. We learned what abuse actually is, and it's not what Baker thinks he's experiencing, but okay. But anyways, we learned what abuse is, and if he wants to know what abuse is, he should look at Eric Menendez. That's an abused person. Okay. Anyways, I'm gonna stay off of that, but I will see you guys next time. I believe we do have. No, what do we have next? I don't remember. We'll find out later because I have no idea. Well, we could go to the thumbnail here. So this is today's thumbnail, and uh, here's 69. So we're continuing on with Dr. John Wilson with 69. So that's all. All right. I think that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching, and let me know in the comments below what you think of this case. Bye, guys.
That's the end of this Trial Transcripts Exposed. Thanks for following along with me. Like if you want more, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.